She didn't scream. She didn't beg. While 400 guests watched her husband walk into his own anniversary gala with another woman on his arm, Claire Donovan stood completely still and smiled, not because she was broken, because she had already decided. That night, in a marble bathroom that cost more than most people's houses, she picked up a pair of scissors and cut off every inch of hair she'd grown since the day she married him. What happened next destroyed one of America's most powerful crime empires, from the inside out. If you want to know how one woman dismantled a dynasty without firing a single shot, stay until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Morelli estate sat on 11 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, the kind of property that didn't appear on real estate listings and wasn't discussed in polite company. It had been purchased through 3 shell companies and a law firm whose senior partners had long since learned not to ask questions. The main house was federal style on the outside, clean columns, white stone, symmetrical windows, but inside it breathed like something older and heavier. The ceilings were 14 feet in the formal rooms. The floors were marble, imported from a quarry outside Carrara that had supplied stone to European palaces for 2 centuries. Vincent Morelli had paid for it in cash and told Claire the receipt was none of her business. That was 11 years ago. Tonight, for the anniversary gala, the estate had been transformed into something that required 6 weeks of planning, 4 catering teams, a separate security detail from the one already stationed at the perimeter, and a floral arrangement budget that Claire had quietly rerouted from the household account through a company she controlled. 400 guests, senators, federal judges, 3 of them. Old family money from Boston and New York, younger money from places that didn't have names in polite conversation. The Ancelotti brothers had flown in from Chicago. Dominic Ferry had come up from Miami with his second wife, a former model who smiled too wide and asked no questions, which made her, Claire had decided long ago, either very smart or very sad. Claire stood at the top of the central staircase at 6:47 in the evening and looked down at all of it. She was wearing a gown she had selected herself, deep burgundy, long-sleeved, severe at the neckline. No jewelry except her wedding band and a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. Her hair was swept up and pinned, dark and heavy, the kind of hair that took 40 minutes to manage, and that Vincent had once said was the most beautiful thing about her. He had said it like a compliment. She had understood it, even then, as a warning. She was 41 years old. She had been married to Vincent Morelli for 11 of those years. She had spent 9 of those 11 years running the legitimate infrastructure of the Morelli organization, the construction subsidiaries, the logistics companies, the property development arm, the private equity vehicles they used to launder investment income into something that could be declared on a tax return. She had done this without title, without public acknowledgement, without a salary, operating instead as Vincent's wife, which meant she was simultaneously the most important person in the organization and the only one who could never say so. Nobody at the party knew that. Most of the men in the room believed she was decorative. The women who knew better kept their mouths shut, because in this world knowing better was its own kind of danger. She descended the staircase at 6:52 and began to work the room the way she always did, methodically, warmly, with the specific skill of making every person she spoke to feel like the most important individual in the space. She knew their names. She knew their children's names. She knew which judges were anxious about re-election cycles, which senators had committee assignments that mattered, which businessmen were overextended, and which ones were quietly sitting on liquidity that might be useful. She had built and maintained these relationships personally for a decade, sometimes over lunches Vincent didn't attend, sometimes over phone calls he never knew happened. This was the invisible labor that kept the empire breathing. Vincent arrived at 7:15. He did not come through the front entrance. He came through the side doors that led from the private garage, the ones used by staff and security. The doors opened, and he walked in with his hand on Sabrina Hale's lower back, and the room, with that particular animal sensitivity that rooms develop when something has shifted in the power structure, went quiet in a ripple that started nearest the door and spread outward until it reached the far corners where the string quartet was playing, and even they seemed to lose a half beat before recovering. Sabrina Hale was 32. She had been Vincent's mistress for 2 years, a fact that Claire had known about for 18 months and chosen, strategically, not to address. She was tall, blonde, dressed in something red and backless that had been designed to be remembered. She was laughing at something Vincent had said, or pretending to laugh, which in this crowd amounted to the same performance. Her hand found his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed this entrance and was delivering it now without visible effort. Vincent Morelli was 54, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with the kind of physical presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around him without anyone consciously deciding to do it. He was not classically handsome. He was something else, the kind of face that communicated authority so completely that people remembered him as better looking than he was. He wore his tuxedo the way he wore everything, like it had been built specifically for him, and everything else in the world was slightly off-fit. He scanned the room as he walked in. His eyes found Claire almost immediately. She was standing near the east window with Dominic Ferry's wife, whose name was Lucia and who was neither as stupid nor as sad as Claire had once assumed. Vincent's gaze held on Claire for 2 seconds. She counted them, and then he looked away. He guided Sabrina toward the center of the room, toward the cluster of the most important guests, and he began the evening with her on his arm. Claire held her expression completely still. Lucia Ferry touched her wrist very gently, the way women in this world communicated things they couldn't say aloud. "Don't," Claire said quietly. Lucia withdrew her hand. "Okay. I'm fine. I know you are. Good." She circulated through the room for the next 90 minutes doing what she always did, and she did it without a single visible crack in her composure. She spoke with the Ancelotti brothers about a construction contract in Pittsburgh that had been creating friction between families. Friction she had already begun to quietly resolve through a subsidiary company before anyone had formally acknowledged the dispute. She sat briefly with Judge Harold Weston, who was anxious about a campaign finance investigation that she happened to know had stalled at the federal level due to a witness problem that had nothing to do with the Morellis, and she reassured him with the specific confidence of someone who actually knew what she was talking about. She guided 3 business conversations toward conclusions that served the organization's long-term interests and would have taken Vincent's advisors another 3 weeks to navigate, and she did it while holding a glass of wine she barely drank and smiling at every appropriate moment. The whole time, across the room, Vincent danced with Sabrina. The formal dinner announcement came at 8:30. The seating chart, which Claire had designed and finalized 2 weeks earlier, placed her at Vincent's right hand at the head table, the traditional position of the wife, the partner, the co-host of an event she had spent 6 weeks building. Vincent sat down. He gestured to Sabrina, who took the seat at his right. There was a staff member nearby, a young man named Marcus who worked events for the estate and who looked in that moment like he would have accepted any excuse to be somewhere else on Earth. He glanced at Claire. She smiled at him very calmly and walked to a different seat further down the long table between a retired city official from Philadelphia and a woman whose husband ran a waste management company in New Jersey. She sat down. She placed her napkin in her lap. She ate. The dinner lasted 2 hours. Over those 2 hours, 7 different people at the table looked at her with some version of pity or discomfort, or the specific curiosity that people feel when watching something collapse slowly enough to be observed. She engaged each of them in conversation. She discussed the Philadelphia real estate market and the development opportunities in the Northern Corridor. She discussed the policy implications of the new federal infrastructure bill on logistics companies. She ate her fish course and her salad course and the dessert that arrived on a hand-blown glass plate that she had personally sourced from an artisan glassblower in Connecticut, because Vincent had wanted the party to feel exceptional. She drank 2 full glasses of water. She did not touch the wine. At 10:15, she excused herself from the table. She crossed the length of the room without hurrying, without looking at Vincent, without any change in her bearing that would have communicated anything other than a woman who needed a moment of privacy in the middle of a long evening. She went upstairs. She walked down the east corridor past the guest rooms, past the sitting room with the fireplace, past the small office she had converted years ago from a storage room into the place where she did her actual work, the work that kept all of it alive. She entered the primary bedroom and closed the door behind her. She stood in the center of the room for a long time without moving. The room was large and expensively furnished, and it smelled like the cedar sachets she ordered seasonally from a shop in Vermont, and the specific dry-cleaned scent of Vincent's suits hanging in the open wardrobe. There were photographs on the bureau, a few, chosen carefully. One of their wedding, one of a trip they'd taken to Sardinia in the early years when things had been different, or at least had felt different, which she now understood was not quite the same thing. One of her own mother, who had died 4 years ago, and who had, near the end, told Claire very quietly that she worried about her, that she didn't look like herself anymore. And Claire had said she was fine, and her mother had said she knew. And the conversation had ended there because some things between mothers and daughters don't require completion. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror on the back of the wardrobe door. She looked at her hair. It was the thing people always mentioned first. Dark, dense, long enough to reach the middle of her back. She'd grown it for years without consciously deciding to, the way women in certain situations accumulate things they never chose. The jewelry that matches the house, the social calendar that serves someone else's ambition, the name that belongs to a family that isn't yours. She walked into the bathroom. The vanity was white marble with a double basin. The lighting was warm and precise, the kind installed by a designer whose job was to make everything look its most controlled version of itself. She opened the center drawer and found the scissors, dressmaking shears sharp, meant for fabric, which she'd placed there 2 weeks ago after she'd made her decision, as calmly as someone might set out an umbrella because they'd checked the forecast. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Then she began to cut. She wasn't dramatic about it. There was no moment of hesitation, no shaking hands, no pause for the weight of it. She took sections of her hair and cut cleanly and quickly, and the dark lengths fell into the basin and onto the floor, and she kept cutting until what remained was short and rough, and entirely hers in a way the longer version had somehow never quite managed to be. It took 11 minutes. She knew because she checked her watch before and after, not because she was timing herself, but because she was already calculating the rest of the evening and she had other things to do before she went back downstairs. She swept the hair from the basin with one hand and dropped it in the small bin beneath the vanity. She ran cold water over her face. She blotted it dry with a towel. She looked at herself in the mirror for the second time. She looked like someone who had made a decision. She looked, for the first time in years, like herself. She went back to the bedroom. She opened the bottom left drawer of the bureau, beneath the folded cashmere sweaters and the scarves she never wore, and she took out the leather folder she had placed there 3 months ago. Inside it were 2 things: a prepaid phone registered to a name that wasn't hers, and a handwritten list of 8 items, each of them checked off one by one, except for the last 2. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the prepaid phone and sent a single text message to a number she had memorized rather than stored. The message read, Thursday. She received a reply in under 2 minutes. The reply was a single word: confirmed. She put the phone in her clutch. She replaced the leather folder in the drawer beneath the cashmere. She stood up, checked herself once more in the wardrobe mirror, ran one hand briefly over her newly short hair, and walked back out of the bedroom. She was downstairs again by 10:44. The first person to see her was Marcus, the event staff member who had witnessed her displacement at the dinner table. He was carrying a tray of champagne flutes toward the main salon, and he stopped completely when he saw her, and she watched the sequence of expressions move across his young face: surprise, confusion, a kind of startled recognition, and then something that softened toward what might have been a different kind of regard than she was accustomed to receiving in this house. She took a champagne flute from his tray, smiled at him, and walked past him into the main salon. The effect of entering a room looking entirely different from how you left it was, she had theorized, dependent almost entirely on the reaction of the first significant person who noticed. That person was Lucia Ferry, who was standing near the bar with a glass of something sparkling, and who saw Claire cross the threshold and went very still. Then Lucia's face did something unexpected. Not pity, not horror, not the conventional response of a woman observing what her world would categorize as a breakdown. Lucia looked at her the way someone looks when they've been waiting for something they weren't sure would ever arrive. She nodded once. Claire nodded back. The ripple moved through the room differently this time, less dramatic, more personal. People turned and looked and turned away, and the whispers began their small circulation, and she observed all of it from inside a calm that had taken her years to develop, and that tonight felt, for the first time, genuinely inhabitable. She found Dominic Ferry and spent 15 minutes discussing a logistics company whose board she sat on, or had sat on, as of 2 days ago, when she had quietly submitted her resignation to the company secretary in an email that had been acknowledged but not yet understood. She discussed it as though her departure were still in the future, because, in the context of this room and this night, creating no visible discontinuity was still strategically valuable. She found Judge Weston again and wished him well. She found the Ancelotti brothers and said goodnight. She did not find Vincent. Vincent found her. He came to her at 11:20 when the party had reached the phase where the oldest guests had begun to leave, and the remaining crowd had loosened slightly, voices louder, the formality gone from the air. He came to her near the east window where she'd been standing when he arrived, and he stood in front of her and looked at her hair with an expression she didn't immediately have a word for. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something more like the expression of a man who has been confronted with evidence that something he believed was solid has begun behaving in a way that solid things are not supposed to behave. "What did you do?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was the specific delivery of a man who believes he is entitled to the answer before the question is fully formed. "I cut my hair," she said. "Tonight." "You cut it tonight." "Yes." "In the middle of our party." She didn't correct him on the pronoun. "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was running calculations behind his eyes. "Are you trying to make a scene?" "I don't think I'm the one making a scene," she said. Her voice was even. It had been even all night. "Are you?" Something shifted in his face. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Am I?" "Claire." "Vincent." She matched his tone precisely. The weight of it, the warning in it, exactly mirrored. She watched him register that. "We'll talk about this later," he said. "Of course," she said. He turned and walked away and found Sabrina, who was across the room laughing with someone whose name Claire could not from this distance determine. He went to Sabrina and put his hand on her back again, and Claire watched him for a moment, not with longing, not with anger, but with the particular clarity of someone looking at something they've already stopped needing. She finished her champagne. She set the glass down on the tray of a passing staff member. She went through the motions of departure, said the remaining goodbyes, thanked the catering manager personally, confirmed with the estate's head of security that the overnight detail was properly staffed, because even tonight, even now, the machinery had to be tended. She went upstairs at 12:40. Vincent was not in the bedroom. She hadn't expected him to be. She changed out of the gown. She folded it carefully, not because she intended to wear it again, but because she had been precise and careful about everything for 11 years, and that habit didn't switch off because a decision had been made. She put on clothes she had laid out earlier that week. Simple, practical, the kind of clothes that travel well. She pulled the single suitcase from the back of the dressing room, the one she had packed over the preceding 2 weeks in increments, adding 1 or 2 items at a time on evenings when Vincent was out, so that there was never a moment of obvious preparation. The suitcase was not full. She had chosen carefully. Documents, a few personal items, the things that were specifically and irreducibly hers. The photograph of her mother. A watch her father had given her before he died. A notebook that contained 9 years of handwritten organizational notes that would have taken a forensic accountant 3 months to fully decode, and that she intended, at the appropriate time, to provide to people she had spent the last 4 months quietly identifying. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was not crying. She did not feel, in this moment, like someone who had lost something. She felt more precisely like someone who had been carrying an enormous amount of weight for a very long time and had set it down, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but simply because the distance had been covered and the destination had been reached and there was no longer any reason to keep carrying it. She was 41 years old. She had built something extraordinary. She had built it entirely for someone else, under someone else's name, in someone else's shadow, and she had done it with a quality and a consistency that the person in whose name she'd done it was not capable of replicating, as he would discover, at a pace she had already calculated in the weeks and months ahead. She picked up the prepaid phone and sent a second message to the same number. It said, "Initiating Phase 2." The reply came in 4 minutes. It said, "All teams ready." She turned off the phone. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She sat quietly for a little longer, not because she was uncertain, but because she was someone who understood the value of stillness before movement, who had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a person could do in certain rooms was to appear completely calm. Downstairs, the last of the guests were leaving. She could hear the specific sounds of a large event winding down, vehicles on the gravel, the controlled voices of security personnel, the muted acoustics of a space that had held hundreds of people and was now releasing them back into the world. She could hear, somewhere on the ground floor, Vincent's voice. She did not go downstairs. She sat with the closed suitcase beside her until 2 in the morning, when the house had quieted entirely and the security rotation had shifted to the overnight configuration she had memorized over a decade of sleeping lightly in a house where she always felt, without quite articulating it to herself, that she needed to know the exits. She picked up the suitcase. She went down the back stairs that led to the kitchen, and from the kitchen to the side entrance that opened onto the service path that ran along the east edge of the property, away from the main gate and the primary security station. She had walked this path at night before, not for practice, not with this in mind, but because she had been the kind of woman who needed to walk sometimes, and the main grounds offered no privacy, and so she knew it. The texture of the gravel, the gap in the exterior lighting near the second bend, the low spot in the fence that had been a maintenance issue for 3 years that no one had bothered to properly address. She walked to her car. It was a car she had registered 2 months ago through one of the subsidiary companies she still technically controlled, a company whose registration renewal she had processed herself and whose signatory authority would not transfer until a filing she had delayed by 6 business days on purpose. She had parked it on a private lane a quarter mile from the estate, the kind of lane that served a neighboring property's delivery vehicles, and was not covered by the Morelli security cameras because she had reviewed the camera placement herself when the system was installed 4 years ago, because she reviewed everything. She put the suitcase in the trunk. She got in. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She started the engine. The clock on the dashboard read 2:18 a.m. She drove. She drove for 40 minutes without stopping, north on roads she had mapped from memory, until she reached a small inn in a town whose name she hadn't told anyone, and which she had booked under a name that was legally hers, her mother's maiden name, which she had never legally changed from because some part of her had always known, or suspected, or quietly hoped that she might need it someday. She checked in. The night clerk barely looked up. She went to the room. It was small and clean and smelled of laundry detergent and the particular neutral nothing of a space that belongs to no one. She set the suitcase on the luggage rack. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser. Her short hair, her face without makeup now, older looking and also, in some way she couldn't immediately name, less burdened. She thought about the morning, about the calls she would make before 7 a.m., about the document that needed to be filed in the Delaware Chancery Court on Thursday, which was also why she'd sent the text that said Thursday, about the 3 board resignations, the 2 LLC dissolutions, and the 1 very carefully worded letter to a federal regulatory body that she had been composing in her head for 6 weeks and would spend the next 2 days putting into its final, permanent form. She thought about the businesses. She thought about the supply chain she had built and could walk away from, the vendor relationships that existed because she had personally negotiated them and would degrade without her attention, the accounting system she had designed with specific, non-obvious logic that no one else in the organization fully understood, the tax structures she had architected through a firm whose senior partner trusted her and not Vincent, the property portfolio whose liquidity depended on decisions only she could authorize. She thought about how long it would take for the first visible crack to appear. 3 weeks, she estimated. Perhaps 4, if someone competent stepped in quickly. But there was no one competent. She had worked alongside these men for 9 years, and she knew their capabilities precisely, the way a physician knows the specific weaknesses of a body they have been studying. Not with contempt, exactly, but with the cold clarity of someone whose survival has required accurate assessment. She also thought about Sabrina, not with jealousy. She was past jealousy. She thought about Sabrina the way she thought about a variable in a financial model, as something that had entered the system and would behave predictably according to its own nature. She had observed Sabrina for 18 months. She knew what Sabrina was. She knew what Sabrina wanted and approximately how she would move to get it, and what the downstream consequences of that movement would be for the financial architecture of an organization that was about to lose the only person who actually understood how to sustain it. Sabrina would accelerate the damage without meaning to. That was useful. She lay back on the bed without undressing. She stared at the ceiling. Outside, it was a quiet Connecticut night. No wind, a faint smell of cut grass through the closed window, the distant sound of a highway too far away to be identifiable. She could hear her own breathing. It was slow and even. Her hands, resting on her stomach, were not shaking. She thought about the 11 years. She wasn't sentimental about them exactly, but she was honest. They had not been nothing. There had been years when she and Vincent had been something real, or close enough to real that the difference was invisible from inside it. There had been years when the work had felt like shared work, when the organization had been a project they were both committed to, when she had believed that her invisibility was a choice she was making rather than a condition being imposed. She had been wrong about that slowly, over a long time, in the way a person is wrong about a building's structural integrity, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a gradual settling, a series of small adjustments that each seem manageable until the sum of them becomes something that can't be walked back. The gala had not surprised her. That was the thing she wanted to be clear about, even just to herself, in this small, anonymous room. She had not been surprised. She had known. She had known for longer than she'd admitted, and what she had spent the last year doing was not grieving or planning revenge. She did not think of it as revenge, but simply building the architecture of a life that didn't require him. That was the actual project. Everything else was a byproduct. She thought she should sleep. She didn't sleep for a long time. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had 8 months ago with a woman named Elaine Marsh, who ran a boutique security consulting firm in Washington and who had reached out to Claire through a mutual contact about a potential advisory role. Claire had declined at the time. It was too early, she was still mid-construction on the exit she was planning. But she had kept Elaine's card, had kept the conversation in the files she maintained in her own head of things worth returning to. She would call Elaine on Thursday morning, not to accept an advisory role, to propose something different, something she had been quietly researching for 4 months, in the margins of everything else she was managing, in the hours before Vincent woke up, and in the small windows between the legitimate work of the organization and the delegating and the relationship management and the invisible necessary labor that no one would name. What she was going to propose would take a year to build properly, maybe 18 months. She was not in a hurry. She had learned over 11 years in proximity to men who moved quickly and loudly that the things that lasted were always built by someone who was willing to move slowly and precisely and without the need to be seen doing it. She closed her eyes. She heard, somewhere outside the window, the sound of a single car passing on the road, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the room, there and then gone. She had a thought, just before she finally crossed into sleep, that surprised her with its simplicity. The thought was, I am the only person who knows everything that happens next. She held it for a moment. Then she slept. 40 minutes away in the Morelli estate, the lights in the main salon were still on. Vincent Morelli was sitting in the library with a glass of scotch and Sabrina Hale's head on his shoulder, and he was talking, half drunk and expansive, about the party, about the city contracts coming up for bid in the spring, about a federal judge in Connecticut he needed to cultivate more seriously, about the 2 families in New York he wanted to bring closer into the Morelli orbit. He talked about all of it with the easy authority of a man who had no reason to believe that anything holding his empire together was anything other than his own force of will. He did not think about Claire's hair. He did not think about Claire's face when she'd said his name back to him with his own tone in it. He did not think about the fact that she had left the party without telling him, or that she was not in the bedroom, or that there was, for the first time in 11 years, a quality to the silence of the house that was different from the usual silence of a house at 3 a.m. He was not, in this moment, paying attention. He would begin paying attention soon. But not yet. The Delaware filing went through at 9:47 on Thursday morning. Claire was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Chancery Court building when her phone buzzed with the confirmation. Not the prepaid phone, the new one she'd purchased the previous afternoon at an electronics retailer in a strip mall outside Hartford, paying cash, giving no name. The confirmation came from the filing service as a standard automated email, the kind that arrived 100 times a day in the inboxes of corporate attorneys and paralegals and never excited anyone. She read it once, put the phone face down on the table, and finished her coffee. Outside the window, Wilmington moved through its ordinary Thursday. Office workers. A delivery truck idling in the left lane. A woman with a stroller navigating the uneven sidewalk with the focused irritation of someone who had done this route before and knew exactly which cracks to avoid. Claire watched all of it with the specific quality of attention she'd developed over years of operating in rooms where missing a detail had consequences. Not anxious attention, not the hypervigilance of someone afraid, but the steady, calibrated awareness of someone who had decided to see things clearly. She called Elaine Marsh at 10. Elaine picked up on the second ring, which told Claire she'd been expected. "I wondered when you'd call," Elaine said. Her voice was low and direct. The voice of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where no one gave you time to warm up. "I told you I'd be in touch. You told me you'd think about it. That was 8 months ago." "I thought about it," Claire said. "I'm not interested in the advisory role." A pause. "Okay. I want to talk about building something separate, independent. I have a concept, and I have the infrastructure knowledge, and I have 11 years of relationship capital in sectors that overlap significantly with what you do." Another pause, longer. "Where are you?" "Wilmington. I can be in Washington by 2. "Make it 3, Elaine said. "I have a lunch I can't move." 3 is fine. She took the Amtrak south. She sat in a window seat and watched Delaware give way to Maryland and Maryland give way to the edge of the district. And she spent the 2 hours of the ride not thinking about Vincent. She had made a specific decision not to spend cognitive resources on Vincent unless strategically necessary, but instead drafting in her head the outline of the proposal she was going to put in front of Elaine. She had been building the outline for 4 months. It was detailed. It was realistic. It accounted for the capital she had access to, the expertise she could legitimately claim, the regulatory environment she understood from a decade of navigating it, from the inside of an organization that had been very motivated to understand it precisely. She arrived at Elaine's office at 3:02. Elaine Marsh was 61, compact, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly and wasn't apologizing for any of them. She had built her security consulting firm over 22 years from a one-woman operation working out of a Georgetown apartment into a 14-person practice with clients in finance, pharmaceuticals, and 2 foreign governments she didn't name in her marketing materials. She had met Claire at a conference 3 years ago, recognized immediately that the woman beside her knew significantly more than her social position suggested, and had filed that recognition away with the patience of someone who understood that useful things sometimes took time to become available. She looked at Claire's hair when Claire walked in. She didn't comment on it. "Sit down," she said. Claire sat. "Tell me what you're building." Claire told her. She talked for 40 minutes without notes, laying out the structure of what she was proposing. A security and organizational intelligence consulting practice targeting mid-market companies with complex operational exposures, leveraging her specific expertise in logistics infrastructure, financial architecture, and the particular kind of institutional knowledge that came from having spent a decade managing the legitimate face of an organization that had very strong incentives to keep its exposure controlled. She did not say the word Morelli. She didn't need to. Elaine had done enough due diligence on Claire 8 months ago to understand the context. When Claire finished, Elaine was quiet for a moment. "You're going to have a legal separation problem," she said. "Whatever you built for them, they're going to argue you can't use the expertise." "The expertise lives in my head," Claire said. "The relationships are mine personally. I maintain them without organizational support. The knowledge is general industry knowledge applied specifically. I've had 3 separate attorneys review the question, and they all agree the same way." 3 attorneys, you've been planning this for a while. "I've been planning this for 14 months. Elaine looked at her for a long moment. "How bad is it going to get for them?" "I don't know what you're referring to." Elaine almost smiled. "How long before it becomes publicly visible?" "That's not something I have any insight into," Claire said. "What I can tell you is that I have full legal separation from every entity I was connected to, beginning as of this morning, and that I have documentation of my own contributions that is both comprehensive and unambiguous. Protective documentation. Thorough documentation. I'm a thorough person. Elaine leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which Claire had already identified as her thinking posture. Then she leaned forward again. I'm not going to be a junior partner in this. I'm not asking you to be. I'm proposing a merger of two independent practices, equal equity, co-management structure, with a clear delineation of client verticals based on existing relationships. I have existing clients. I know, none of them overlap with what I'm bringing in. You're very confident for someone who left her previous position 12 hours ago. I didn't leave a position, Claire said. I was never officially in one. That one landed. She watched Elaine register it. The specific injustice of it, the very particular kind of professional erasure that Elaine, who had built her own firm precisely to avoid that erasure, would recognize from the inside. All right, Elaine said. I want to see the documentation on your client relationships. I want a formal proposal in writing by Monday, and I want to understand what your capital exposure looks like, because I'm not absorbing liability I don't have visibility into. You'll have full visibility, Claire said. That's a condition I'm offering, not one you need to demand. She left Elaine's office at 4:45. She walked 3 blocks to a hotel on K Street that she'd booked that morning and checked in. The room was standard business travel. Neutral colors, good Wi-Fi, a desk lamp that actually worked. She sat at the desk and began writing the formal proposal on her laptop. She worked until 1 in the morning. She did not check the news. She did not call anyone she'd known as Claire Morelli. She ordered room service at 9, a sandwich and coffee, ate it at the desk, and kept working. She slept from 1 to 6, showered, put on the second outfit from her suitcase, and was at the desk again by 6:30. She had not thought about the estate in 2 days. This was not avoidance. It was allocation. She had decided what her cognitive resources were for, and she was using them for that purpose. And the estate and everything in it belonged to a category of things that would proceed according to its own logic, regardless of whether she was thinking about it. So thinking about it was a form of waste she couldn't afford. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, sitting in the K Street Hotel with her proposal document open and her second coffee of the morning cooling beside the keyboard, was that Vincent had already discovered she was gone. He had discovered it at 6:15 Thursday morning when he came to bed, finally, from wherever he and Sabrina had spent the night, and found the room empty. Not just empty of Claire, empty of her in the specific, irreversible way that a room is empty when the person who inhabits it has taken the things that are specifically theirs and left behind only the things that belong to the space. He had called her cell phone. The line rang 8 times and went to voicemail. He stood in the middle of the bedroom in his tuxedo shirt, with his collar open and his expression moving through stages that Sabrina, watching from the doorway, catalogued with the practiced attention of a woman who knew better than to say anything until the right moment. He called her again at 6:30. Voicemail. He sent a text that said, "Call me back." He sent a second text at 7 that said, "Claire, now." No response. He called Marcus, the event staff member, at 7:15 because Marcus had been the last person he could remember having visible contact with Claire the previous evening. Marcus said, with the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to take sides in something he didn't fully understand, that he'd seen Mrs. Morelli around 10:40, that she'd seemed fine, that she'd taken a champagne glass from his tray and gone into the main salon, and that he hadn't seen her after that. Vincent called his head of security at 7:30. A man named Carl Diaz, who had worked for the Morelli organization for 14 years and whose loyalty was, as loyalty in this world always was, calibrated to the specific circumstances of the moment. Carl said that the overnight cameras showed Mrs. Morelli's personal vehicle, the gray sedan she drove occasionally, leaving the service lane at 2:22 a.m. He said that no one had flagged it because the vehicle was registered and its departure hadn't triggered any security protocol. "Why?" Vincent said. "Does she have a car parked in the service lane?" Carl said he didn't know. Vincent sat with that for a moment. "Find out where she went," he said. "Any parameters on that?" Carl said. "Find her," Vincent said. That's the parameter. He changed out of his tuxedo. He went to the kitchen, where the staff was arriving for the morning, and he poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen island and thought. Sabrina appeared 20 minutes later in one of his shirts, her blonde hair loose, and she poured herself coffee from the same pot and leaned against the counter with the particular ease of a woman who had decided to behave as though she'd always had a right to be there. "She'll call," Sabrina said. Vincent looked at her. "She's making a point," Sabrina said. "She'll come back when she's made it." "You don't know her," he said. "I know how women like her think." The sentence sat in the kitchen air between them for a moment. Vincent drank his coffee. He thought about what Claire had said the night before, the way she'd said his name back to him, tone-matched, without blinking. He thought about the scissors and the bathroom and the hour unaccounted for between when she'd gone upstairs and when she'd come back down. He thought about the hair in the basin, which one of the overnight staff had found and disposed of, not knowing what to make of it. "What do you mean, women like her?" he said. Sabrina seemed to consider her phrasing for a moment. Controlled women. Women who've been managing themselves in a situation for a long time. They do something visible, make a gesture. Then they wait to see the response. "She didn't wait," he said. "She left." Sabrina's expression shifted slightly. "That's different," she conceded. He called his attorney at 9. His attorney was a man named Gerald Posen, 63 years old, who handled the legal architecture of the legitimate side of the Morelli organization through a firm whose other clients were hedge funds and major real estate developers. Gerald had Claire's contact information in his own files, because Claire had been, as he had understood it, the operational point person for most of the entities he managed. He had liked working with Claire. She was precise. She was always prepared, and she never wasted his time. He had always found it slightly strange that she wasn't named on more of the formal organizational documents, but he had also been in this business long enough to know that the structures of other people's marriages were not his area of expertise. He picked up on the first ring. "Vincent," he said, "I was going to call you this morning." "About what?" "I received a notification from the Delaware Chancery Court this morning regarding a filing. The Orion Group, LLC, the property development vehicle. There's been an amendment to the operating agreement. Claire's membership interest has been formally separated and dissolved." The kitchen went quiet in a way kitchens don't usually go quiet. "Say that again," Vincent said. Gerald said it again. "How?" Vincent said. "She had full signatory authority. It was in the original operating agreement. She's been the managing member of record for Orion since 2019. Vincent put his coffee down. "What else?" "I'm still reviewing. I received the Orion notification 20 minutes ago, and I started pulling the other entities. I need more time to review fully, but there are at least 3 other LLCs where she had equivalent authority. I'm also seeing what appears to be a formal board resignation from her position with the Castellan Group, effective Monday." She resigned from the Castellan board. Effective Monday, yes. The letter was filed with the company secretary last week. Last week. She had done it last week. While she was finalizing the seating chart for the anniversary party and sourcing hand-blown glass dessert plates and managing the catering timeline, she had been filing the paperwork to extract herself from every structural position she held in his organization. He picked up his coffee cup. He put it back down. "Get me a full inventory of every entity she had authority over, everything. I need it today." "I'm working on it," Gerald said. "Vincent, I want to be clear with you. This is going to take time to untangle. Some of these structures, the way they were built, I'm going to need time." "How much time?" A pause. "To understand it fully? Weeks, possibly." He ended the call. Sabrina had moved to the far side of the kitchen island. She was holding her coffee cup with both hands, and her expression had changed. The ease was gone, replaced by something more calculating, and he noticed that she was watching him the way people watch something they're not sure is safe to stand next to. "She's been planning this," he said. Sabrina said nothing. "For how long?" he said. Not to her, not to anyone. To the kitchen, to the specific silent fact of what he was beginning to understand. He left the kitchen without another word. He went to the library, which was where he worked when he wanted to think without the organizational noise of his regular office in the city, and he sat behind the desk and he called, one by one, the four people he trusted most in the operational structure of the organization. His deputy, a man named Frank Calhoun, who had been with him for 17 years. The head of the construction subsidiary, Eddie Tran. The financial manager of the property portfolio, a man named Steve Annis, who was meticulous and moderately competent, and who had, he now recalled, deferred almost everything of structural complexity to Claire for as long as he'd been in the role. And his operations coordinator, a woman named Dana Page, who managed the day-to-day administration of the legitimate businesses. He told each of them, in turn, that he needed a status update. The updates were not reassuring. Frank said the Pittsburgh construction contract, the one that had been on the verge of resolution, had gone quiet. The counterparty they'd been negotiating with had sent a brief email that morning saying they needed more time and would be in touch. He wasn't sure why. He'd been expecting the contract to close this week. Eddie said the licensing renewal for the Hartford construction subsidiary was coming up in 30 days, and he'd been waiting on Claire to finalize the documentation package for the renewal application. He'd assumed she'd get to it. He hadn't thought to follow up. Steve said 3 property sale transactions that were supposed to close in the next 60 days had some structural questions in the underlying agreements that he hadn't been able to fully resolve. He'd been meaning to review them with Claire, he said, but she'd been busy with the party preparation and he hadn't wanted to bother her. Dana said a major vendor, a logistics firm they used across 4 of their companies, had sent an email 2 weeks ago asking for a renewal meeting. Claire had apparently scheduled the meeting for next week. Dana wasn't sure what was on the agenda or what the renewal terms were. Vincent sat behind the library desk and absorbed all of this. He understood, with a quality of understanding that didn't announce itself but simply arrived, like a change in air pressure before a weather system, that what he was looking at was not the aftermath of an angry wife leaving in the night. He was looking at the consequence of an architecture he'd never bothered to understand removing itself from the building. 3 weeks after the gala, the first visible crack appeared. It was the Hartford licensing renewal. Without the documentation package, the application couldn't be filed. Without the filing, the subsidiary's operating license lapsed. Without the license, 3 active construction projects had to pause operations. The pause triggered penalty clauses in 2 client contracts. The penalties were not enormous in absolute terms, $140,000, but they were the first external evidence that something was wrong inside the Morelli operation. And in a world where perception was its own kind of currency, external evidence of internal disorder had a cost that exceeded the dollar amount. Vincent put Frank Calhoun on it. Frank spent 4 days trying to reconstruct the documentation package from files and records. He reconstructed roughly 60% of it. The remaining 40% lived in organizational systems that Claire had designed with a specific logic that no one else in the structure had ever needed to understand because she had always been there to operate them. They filed a partial application. The licensing authority asked for additional documentation. Frank asked Eddie. Eddie didn't have it. Frank asked Steve. Steve said he thought Claire had those records. Frank called the law firm that handled the subsidiary's corporate work. The firm said their point of contact for that entity had been Mrs. Morelli directly, and that they weren't sure who had authority to speak with them in her absence because the operating agreement specified her as managing member. The operating agreement that she had amended and separated from in Delaware. On a Thursday morning, while she was drinking coffee and watching Wilmington move through its ordinary day. Vincent was in the library on the 3rd Friday after the gala when Carl Diaz came in with a report on what he'd been able to find about Claire's movements. Carl had tracked the vehicle to a gas station east of Hartford on Thursday morning, then to a parking garage in Wilmington, then lost the trail. He had found a hotel charge on a credit card registered to a name he didn't recognize, Clary Sutton, which was her mother's maiden name, at a hotel in Washington, D.C. from Thursday afternoon through Sunday morning. He had found no further trail after Sunday. She had not used that card again, or if she had, it had been in locations his sources couldn't access. Washington, Vincent said. Yes. What's in Washington? Could be a lot of things, Carl said carefully. She doesn't go to Washington. She's never had Washington contacts. Carl's expression said, with the diplomacy of a man who had survived 17 years by being careful with what he communicated to his boss, that this might be a belief worth revisiting. Vincent let the silence sit for a moment. "Keep looking," he said. Carl left. Vincent stayed in the library. Outside the window, the Connecticut property was doing what it always did in late fall, going gray and bare, the manicured grounds losing their groomed perfection as the season moved in. He had always liked this property. He had been proud of it. He had told people about it at the specific moments when telling people about property served a purpose, and he had never once thought about who had managed the relationships with the groundskeepers, the maintenance contractors, the systems vendors, the insurance carriers, the property tax attorneys. He knew now. He had always known, in the vague and unexamined way that a man knows things he has decided not to need to think about. He was beginning to think about them now. Sabrina arrived that Friday afternoon with 2 overnight bags and the particular forward energy of a woman who had decided that a vacuum was an invitation. She came into the library where he was working and she put her arms around him from behind and she said she'd had some ideas about the Pittsburgh situation. Her cousin worked in municipal contracting, she said. Maybe there were people he should be talking to. And she said she'd also been thinking about the property portfolio, that maybe what he needed was to simplify, to sell some of the smaller assets and concentrate capital in the better performing ones. He said, "What do you know about the portfolio?" She said she'd been looking at some of the numbers, that she'd found some files on the shared drive that Vincent had given her access to when she started spending more time at the estate. He went very still. What shared drive? She told him. It was a cloud storage system used for organizational documents. She had been given access 8 months ago. He had given her access, he remembered it. It had seemed unremarkable at the time, a convenience, and she had apparently been familiarizing herself with the organizational structure with a thoroughness he hadn't realized or thought to question. "What files?" he said. His voice was flat. Careful. "The property stuff, mostly. Some of the LLC documents. I was just trying to understand the business." She said it easily, with the lightness of someone who had prepared for this conversation and practiced the lightness. "You've been reading organizational documents." "I was just curious. I wanted to understand what you were managing." He removed her arms from around him. He did it without particular force, but also without gentleness. He turned around and looked at her. "Those documents are not for you to read," he said. "Vincent, I'm just trying to... They're not for you." A pause. Something moved behind her eyes. Not hurt, he thought. Something harder than hurt. "I'm trying to help." "Then answer me a question," he said. "The Pittsburgh contract, the counterparty that went quiet. Their contact name is Lester Webb. Have you spoken to Lester Webb?" The pause was half a second too long. "No," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time with the specific quality of attention he used when he was deciding what something meant. And she held the look, which itself told him something, because people who have nothing to manage don't need to hold looks. "Okay," he said. He turned back to the desk. "I need to work." She left the library. He sat at the desk, and he thought about Lester Webb, and he thought about the shared drive access, and he thought about Sabrina's cousin in municipal contracting, and he thought about the specific kind of intelligence that required weeks of reading organizational documents to acquire. He called Frank. "The Pittsburgh deal," he said. "How far along was Lester Webb in the negotiation when Claire was handling it?" Frank said he thought it was close. Very close. He said Claire had indicated to him, a few weeks before the gala, that it was essentially done, just needed final signatures. "Who else knew it was close?" Vincent said. A pause. "You, me, Claire, Lester Webb, obviously. Sabrina was at the dinner last month when we discussed Pittsburgh." Another pause. Frank, very carefully, said, "I think she may have been, yes." He ended the call. He sat in the library until 9 that evening. He ate dinner alone at the kitchen island and sent Sabrina, who was in the sitting room with a glass of wine and her phone, a text that said he was going to be working late and she should use the guest room. She replied with a single emoji, a heart that made him feel something he identified not as affection, but as the specific wariness of a man who has just realized that the wrong person has had access to his house for longer than he understood. On the 5th week after the gala, the Castellan Group Board formally accepted Claire's resignation and elected a new board member at a special meeting held without Vincent's involvement, because technically the Castellan Group was a separate entity with its own governance structure, and he was not on the board. He had never needed to be on the board because Claire had been on the board. He called the chairman, a man named Peter Dahl, who was 67 and methodical, and who owed the Morelli family a debt that was old enough to have calcified into something that both parties treated as permanent. Peter said, with the careful pronunciation of a man delivering bad news to someone who had bad reactions to it, "Vincent, I have to tell you, since Claire left the board, some of the institutional investors have been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about the organizational structure, about the management capacity. There's a capital call coming up in March, and 2 of the LPs have indicated they may need more assurance before they commit. I'll have Frank Calhoun on a call with them by Monday." A pause. "The questions are somewhat specific to the financial architecture, the way the investment vehicles were structured. I don't know if Frank has set up the call," Vincent said. He ended the call before Peter finished the sentence. He went looking for Steve Annis's most recent memo on the property portfolio. He found a memo dated 6 weeks before the gala. The memo had a section titled Pending Items. Action required and listed 9 items, each of them cross-referenced to documentation that had to be reviewed before various deadlines. Next to each item was a single initial, C, every single item. C. C, C, C. C. He read through the memo twice. He put it down on the desk. He picked it up again and read it a 3rd time, as though the repetition might produce a different set of initials. It didn't. He was sitting with that document when his phone rang. It was Gerald Posen. "I have the full inventory," Gerald said. "I've finished reviewing all the entities." "Tell me." She had managing member authority or equivalent board authority over 11 entities. She has formally separated from all 11, some through the Delaware filing, some through board resignation letters filed with company secretaries. All of it properly documented, all of it within her legal authority under the existing operating agreements. A pause. "Vincent, I want to be honest with you about what I'm seeing here. The operating agreements for most of these entities were drafted in a way that gave her very broad authority. I don't know if you were aware of that when they were set up. I was aware. The separation she's executed is legally clean. I don't see a basis to challenge it, and there's something else." He waited. "The financial documentation, the records for all 11 entities. The primary system for all of them is a proprietary organizational management system that she appears to have built herself over the years. It's not standard software. It's a custom architecture. Our IT people have been looking at it for 2 days and they don't fully understand the structure." The library was very quiet. "What does that mean practically?" he said. "It means we can see the data, but we can't always interpret it correctly without understanding how the system was built. It's like she built the file system, and she's the only one who knows the filing logic." He put the phone on the desk without ending the call. He sat with his hands flat on the desktop and breathed. He could hear Gerald saying his name distantly from the phone speaker. He picked the phone back up. "Get me someone who can reverse engineer it. I've engaged 2 firms. It's going to take time." "How much?" "Honestly, months. This isn't a simple system. This is..." "Vincent, whoever built this was very sophisticated. It's not sabotage, technically. Every record is there. But the architecture is... It requires knowing how it was built to navigate correctly." He ended the call. Months. He sat in the library, and outside the Connecticut night was doing what Connecticut nights do in November. Cold and clear and indifferent to the specific quality of disorder happening inside the federal-style house on 11 manicured acres. He sat there for a long time. Long enough for the heating system to cycle on and off twice. Long enough for the lights in the guest wing to go off, which meant Sabrina had gone to bed. He thought about the anniversary gala and Claire standing at the east window with Lucia Ferry and not looking at him when Sabrina walked in. He thought about Claire crossing the room to the head table and sitting somewhere else without a visible pause. He thought about the hair, the scissors, the specific quality of decision in that action that he'd read as grief or instability and was now revising as something else entirely, as the visible, deliberate surface of something that had been underway for a very long time before he saw it. 14 months, the attorney in Washington had told a woman in a hotel room. He didn't know that. He didn't know any of what had happened in Washington, but he knew enough now to understand the shape of it, the dimensions of a plan that had been operating invisibly alongside the daily functioning of his organization, built by someone who understood the organization better than anyone else because she had built most of it herself. He felt something he didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't regret exactly. It was the specific texture of a man confronting the distance between what he'd believed was true and what was actually true, and finding that the gap was larger than he could comfortably account for. He opened his laptop. He typed Claire's name into the search field of the organizational system he could see, but not navigate correctly. Her name appeared on 843 documents. He closed the laptop. He went upstairs. He did not go to the guest wing. He went to the primary bedroom, which still carried the faint cedar scent of the sachets she'd ordered, and he lay down without undressing, and he stared at the ceiling, and he thought about 11 years and what they had actually contained and what he had actually understood of them while they were happening. His phone buzzed. A text from Carl Diaz. It said, "Found something. Can we talk tomorrow?" He replied, "Now." Carl called 30 seconds later. He said, "I found her company registration. She filed with the state of Virginia last week. Company name is Sutton Meridian Group. The registered agent is a DC-based firm. I cross-referenced the name, and there's a public LinkedIn profile. Says Claire E. Sutton, co-founder and managing director, Sutton Meridian Group." He lay on the bed with the phone against his ear. "Co-founder," he said. "She has a partner named Elaine Marsh. Marsh has her own existing firms, Marsh Strategic, with offices in D.C. The merger appears to be complete." A pause. "Vincent," Carl said, "there's something else." Sutton Meridian's listed service categories on the registration. One of them is organizational intelligence consulting. Another is financial architecture advisory. He said nothing. Those are basically what she was doing for us, Carl said, for the organization. Except now it's a legitimate registered company with her name on it. And it looks like they're already in client development because there's a... Carl. "Yeah." "Stop talking." "Okay." He ended the call. He lay on the bed in the room that smelled like her cedar sachets, and he understood, with the finality of something that couldn't be walked back, that he was not looking at a woman who had left him. He was looking at a woman who had left him 6 months ago, or a year ago, or maybe longer, had already separated herself in every way that mattered, and had spent the intervening time completing the technical work of making the separation permanent. And what he had experienced at the gala and in the weeks since was not the beginning of a crisis. It was the moment the crisis became visible. The empire he had spent 30 years building was not being attacked by a rival family, not being dismantled by federal investigators, not collapsing under the weight of bad decisions or betrayed alliances. It was dissolving because the woman who had quietly, invisibly, without a single acknowledgement or title or line of credit, built the functional infrastructure of that empire, had walked out of it with a suitcase and a pair of scissors, and had spent the past 5 weeks building something new under her own name. And somewhere out there, beyond the Connecticut property and the 11 acres and the federal-style house with the 14-foot ceilings, in a registered office in Virginia, or a meeting room in Washington, or on a call with someone he had never met and couldn't reach, she was still working. He understood, in this moment, with a clarity that the last 5 weeks had been building toward, that there was one thing he needed to do that nothing else could substitute for. He needed to find her. Not to threaten, not to negotiate, not to try to bring her back into the structure she had so precisely dismantled. He needed to find her, because he had begun to understand that she knew something about what was coming for his organization that he didn't know yet, and that whatever it was moving whether he moved or not. And the only person who had the full map of it was a woman named Claire Sutton, who had registered a company in Virginia and had, he was certain of this, he felt it with the animal certainty of a man who had been in proximity to power long enough to recognize its specific gravity, had been in contact with people he would very much have preferred she hadn't been in contact with. He sat up. He picked up his phone. He sent a text to Frank Calhoun that said, "Tomorrow morning, my office. Bring everything we have on Sutton Meridian Group." Then he sat on the edge of the bed and he thought about the notebook he had seen Claire carry occasionally over the years. Small, black, with a clasp, and how he had never once asked her what was in it because he had never needed to know. He needed to know now, because the notebook was gone. And whatever was in it was out there in the world, in the hands of a woman who had spent 9 years recording everything, and who had, sometime in the last 5 weeks, chosen what to do with it. The meeting in Frank Calhoun's office happened at 7 in the morning before the regular staff arrived, in the kind of early morning quiet that buildings have when the heat hasn't fully cycled and the fluorescent lights are still warming to their full color. Vincent sat across the table from Frank and Carl Diaz and Gerald Posen, who had driven up from the city the night before and looked like a man who hadn't slept, which he hadn't. Frank had the Sutton Meridian file on the table. It wasn't thick, the company was 3 weeks old, but what it contained was specific enough to make the room feel smaller than it was. She filed for LLC status in Virginia on November 4th, Frank said. Registered agent is a firm called Caldwell Associates in Arlington. Co-founder Elaine Marsh has an existing practice, security consulting, organizational intelligence, boutique, DC-based, 22 years in operation, good reputation, no organizational exposure, completely clean. Client base, Vincent said. Marsh's existing clients are mostly financial sector, 2 pharmaceutical companies, 1 foreign government, a trade ministry, not a security ministry, so it's legitimate on its face. Sutton Meridian as a combined entity appears to be an active business development. We found 2 LinkedIn connections between Claire's new profile and senior people at 2 mid-market logistics companies. We think those are prospective clients. Logistics, Vincent said. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. The logistics sector was where the organization had some of its deepest legitimate roots. The vendor relationships, the contract structures, the institutional knowledge of how logistics companies were financed and operated and where their regulatory vulnerabilities lived. That was Claire's territory in the most specific possible sense. She had built it, negotiated it, maintained it. If she was moving into logistics consulting with a clean partner and a Virginia LLC, she was not moving into unfamiliar territory. She was moving into territory she had already mapped. "The notebook," he said, looking at Carl. "We've searched the estate. It's not here. It was never in the organizational system. It was a physical document. She took it with her." Gerald said, "I need to ask you something directly, Vincent. Ask." "The notebook. What's in it?" The table was quiet. Frank looked at the wall. Carl looked at the table. Vincent looked at Gerald. "Organizational records," he said. "Management notes. Decision documentation." "Whose decisions?" "The organization's." Gerald took his glasses off and set them on the table with the deliberate slowness of a man about to say something he'd been calculating the risk of for several days. If the notebook contains documentation of organizational decisions that cross from the legitimate side to the other side, and if that notebook is now in the possession of someone who has separated herself completely from the organization and registered a new company and appears to be in active contact with the market, Gerald, I'm telling you the risk profile. I understand the risk profile. I don't think you do, Gerald said, and he said it with the specific quiet of a man who had been practicing this sentence. Because if she has documentation and she's made contact with federal investigators, which is something I cannot rule out based on what we know, she hasn't, Vincent said. You don't know that. I know her. Gerald put his glasses back on. He did it very slowly. You knew the woman who ran your organization for 9 years without a title or a salary while you were publicly partnered with someone else. That's who you knew. You did not know what she was planning. You did not know she'd been planning it for 14 months. You did not know she had authority to extract herself from 11 entities in a single morning. If you had known those things, we would not be sitting here. A pause. So I want to be careful about what we claim to know. The room was quiet enough that Vincent could hear the heat cycling in the walls. Find her, he said to Carl. Not surveillance. I need to speak with her. She doesn't have to speak with you. She'll speak with me. Carl nodded once and left. Frank gathered the file and also left, with the specific efficiency of a man who knew when the important part of a meeting had concluded. Gerald stayed. There's something else, Gerald said when the door had closed. There's always something else. The Ancelotti brothers. Marco called me yesterday. He looked at Gerald. About what? The Pittsburgh contract. He says the counterparty, Lester Webb, reached out to him directly, offering to renegotiate the terms of the deal outside of the Morelli arrangement. Marco says he's considering it. The air in the room shifted. Vincent felt it shift, felt it in the specific way that the body registers threat before the mind has fully processed the information. A tightening in the chest, a heat behind the eyes, a stillness that replaced whatever had been moving. Webb went directly to Marco, he said. That's what Marco told me. And Marco is telling me. Marco is informing you, yes. Whether that's loyalty or strategy, I'll leave to your judgment. He left the office and drove back to the estate. He drove himself without Carl or any of the security detail, which was something he rarely did but needed to do today because he needed the 40 minutes to think without the pressure of another person's presence. He drove north on the highway and he thought about Lester Webb, and he thought about Sabrina at the dinner, and he thought about Sabrina reading documents on the shared drive, and he thought about her cousin in municipal contracting, and he thought about the Pittsburgh deal, which had been essentially closed according to Claire, very close to signatures, and which had then gone quiet precisely at the moment that Claire left, and Sabrina moved more permanently into the estate. He thought about 8 months ago, when he had given Sabrina access to the shared drive. He thought about what was on the shared drive. He thought about the Pittsburgh contract file, which had been on the shared drive. Lester Webb's contact information was on the shared drive. He called Frank from the car. The Pittsburgh contract file. It was in the shared organizational drive. A pause. Yes. Lester Webb's contact information. His personal cell, the one he doesn't use for official business. Another pause. Longer. Claire had that in the file. She'd developed that contact personally. It was in the drive. It was in the drive, Frank confirmed, with the tone of a man who had just arrived at the same destination from a different direction and was not pleased about the view. Get me everything on Sabrina's drive access history, he said. What she opened, when she opened it, how long she spent in it. He ended the call before Frank could respond. He drove. He had made a very specific kind of mistake. He understood that now with the same reluctant precision with which a man understands a structural error in a building he built himself, not with surprise exactly, because the warning signs had been there, but with the particular weight of knowing that understanding it now didn't undo the consequences. He had brought someone into his house who had used the access he gave her to mine. Information she had then apparently been moving, piece by piece, out of the organization and into the hands of people he hadn't wanted it reaching. He didn't know the full extent of it yet. He was going to find out the full extent of it, and he suspected it was going to be considerably worse than what he currently had evidence for. He arrived at the estate at 9:40. Sabrina was in the kitchen. She was dressed and put together and drinking coffee at the island with her phone face down in front of her, and she looked up when he came in with the specific composure of a woman who had been expecting him, who had perhaps been sitting in this kitchen since 7 in the morning preparing for this exact moment. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. He said, "Tell me about Lester Webb." She held his gaze for 1.5 seconds. He counted. Then she looked down at her coffee cup and she said, "I don't know what you mean." "You read the Pittsburgh file. You read the contact information, Webb's personal cell." "Vincent, when did you call him?" "I didn't." "Sabrina." He said it the way he said things when the patience was gone and what remained was the other thing, the thing that had kept men compliant in rooms for 30 years. "I know you called him. I'm going to know when you called him and how many times inside of 2 hours. What I'm asking you right now is whether you want to be the person who tells me or the person who makes me find out another way." Her jaw moved. She looked at her coffee. She looked back at him. "He reached out to me," she said. "I didn't initiate it." "He reached out to you," he repeated. Lester Webb found your personal number and called you to discuss a construction contract. My cousin put us in touch. He knew about the deal from conversations he'd been part of. Your cousin, who works in municipal contracting? Yes. Who you told me might be useful for the Pittsburgh situation. I was trying to help. Her voice had shifted. Not defensive, something more strategic than defensive. I was trying to bring something to the table. You were in the middle of this situation with Claire and everything was falling apart, and I thought, what did you tell Webb? Nothing he didn't already know. What did you tell Webb? She put her coffee down. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but with the specific posture of someone who has decided that the performance of innocence has run its course and what's left is something more direct. I told him the deal was in transition, that the person who'd been managing the relationship was no longer available, that there might be room to revisit the terms. The kitchen was very quiet. You told him the relationship was in transition, he said. I was trying to create an opening. You told him my organization was in transition. You told a man who is a potential partner on a multi-million-dollar deal that the organizational management structure was unstable. He stopped. He was very still. And then he called Marco Ancelotti. She said nothing. You didn't know about Marco, he said. You didn't know that Webb going to Marco was a consequence of what you told him. Because you don't know how this world works. You know how to read files. You know how to make calls. You don't know what those calls produce. Vincent, get out of my house. She looked at him. Not in an hour, he said. Not when you're ready. Get out of my house now. She left. She left without arguing, which told him everything he needed to know about what she had prepared for and what she had decided she could afford to sacrifice. He watched her collect her things from the guest wing with an efficiency that matched his own. The 2 overnight bags, the toiletries, the shoes she'd left in the entryway. She was at the front door in 11 minutes. She paused in the doorway and looked back at him, and she said, I wasn't working against you. I know what you were doing, he said. It doesn't matter what you'd call it. She left. He stood in the entryway after the door closed, and he listened to the sound of her car on the gravel, and then the absence of the sound, and then the estate's particular silence, which felt different now than it had a month ago, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people in it. He went to the library and sat at the desk, and for the first time in 30 years, he did not know what to do next. That was the honest truth of it. He was a man who had always known what to do next. In rooms, in negotiations, in situations where other men froze, he had always had the ability to see the next move. It was the thing that had built the empire. It was the thing that had made him what he was. And sitting in the library at 9:54 in the morning of a gray November day, with 2 of his most profitable subsidiaries stalled, one board relationship deteriorating, a major contract in danger of going to a rival family, a mistress who had mined his organizational files for competitive intelligence, and a federal regulatory letter he'd received that morning from the SEC asking for documentation on the Castellan Group's investment structure. He did not know what to do next because the person who had always known what came next, who had been the operational intelligence behind every successful decision the organization had made for 9 years, was a woman named Claire Sutton, who was no longer in the building. He sat with that for a long time. The SEC letter was on the desk. He looked at it. The request was formal and precisely worded, and what it asked for was detailed documentation of the investment structure of the Castellan Group's primary fund vehicle, the structure that Claire had designed, that no one else in the organization fully understood, that lived in a proprietary system that 2 IT firms had been working to decode for 3 weeks without success. The deadline on the letter was 45 days. He called Gerald. The SEC letter, he said. I received my copy this morning, Gerald said. I've been waiting for your call. Tell me where we stand. We have 45 days to produce documentation that demonstrates the fund structure is compliant. That documentation exists. Claire built a clean structure. She wouldn't have built it dirty because that would have created exposure for her personally. But the documentation lives in the system our IT people can't navigate correctly. Then we need Claire to navigate it. A long pause. You'd be asking her to cooperate with a regulatory response for an organization she's legally separated from and that you believe she may have already been in contact with federal bodies about. I'll make it worth her while." "She has her own company," Gerald said. "Worth her while is a different calculation than it was 2 months ago." He ended the call. He thought about calling her. He had her number, the old number, the one she'd had for years. He'd called it 11 times in the 5 weeks since the gala, and it had gone to voicemail every time, and eventually, around the 3rd week, it had been disconnected. She had a new number. Somewhere. He didn't have it. He thought about the 45 days. He thought about what happened to organizations that couldn't satisfy SEC documentation requests. Not the criminal side. That was a separate exposure, a separate legal structure, a separate world. The legitimate side. The side that had bank accounts and institutional investors and board members with reputations and clients who did due diligence. The side that Claire had spent 9 years building into something that could actually sustain the weight of the other side. If the legitimate side collapsed, the other side had nowhere to put its money. If the other side had nowhere to put its money, it became visible. If it became visible, the federal interest that was currently a series of polite documentary requests would become something considerably less polite. He sat with that chain of logic until 1 in the afternoon. Then his phone rang. Unknown number, Virginia area code. He picked up. "Vincent." It was Claire's voice. The same register, the same quality of control in it that he remembered from the kitchen the morning after the gala, from every conversation they'd had over 11 years, from the east window at the anniversary party where she'd stood with Lucia Ferry and looked completely composed while the room watched her be publicly replaced. He said nothing for a moment. "I see you've been looking for me," she said. "I need to speak with you." "You are speaking with me." "In person." "No," she said, simply, without elaboration. "Claire, I have 30 minutes. Talk." He told her about the SEC letter. He laid it out factually, without plea and without threat, because he knew both would be ineffective, and because somewhere in the last 5 weeks he had developed a new understanding of who he was talking to and what strategies had purchased with her and which ones didn't. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. He could hear, faintly, the ambient sound of an office, a controlled environment, other voices at a distance, the specific quiet of a professional space. "The Castellan documentation is in the system," she said. "It's under a directory structure that uses a date-based indexing convention. The root folder for Castellan is labeled with the entity's incorporation date, not its operational start date. That's the part the IT firms won't find intuitively. The incorporation date was March 14th, 2018. He wrote it down. "The fund structure documentation is in a subfolder called Compliance Architecture. The naming convention uses the SEC form number as a prefix. Form A, DV, Form D, the whole sequence. It's all there." "That's it?" "That's enough for Gerald to find it. He's competent enough for that." A pause. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The Ancelotti situation. Webb going to Marco. That wasn't accidental. Someone who understood the organizational relationship suggested that move to Webb. Someone who knew that Marco would tell you, and that you learning about it from Marco instead of discovering it yourself would cost you standing. It was designed to cost you standing." A pause. "That person is not me." "I know," he said. "She's gone." A silence. "Gone as in out of the house, or gone as in out of the house?" "That's not gone enough," Claire said. "Whatever she took out of your files before she left." "And she took things, Vincent, because that's what she was there to do. She's already moved it somewhere you can't reach it." He felt something cold move through him. "What do you mean, moved it?" "I mean, she wasn't a woman who fell in love with a married man and made some phone calls to a contractor. She was there specifically. She was placed." A pause. "I started seeing the pattern about 4 months before the gala. I don't know who placed her. I know she wasn't incidental." The library was very cold suddenly, or felt very cold, the way rooms feel when the thing you thought was solid reveals itself to be made of something else. "You knew," he said. "I suspected. And you didn't tell me." "You weren't asking me for intelligence assessments of your personal life," she said. You were ignoring everything I had to say about anything that wasn't in writing and in front of 3 witnesses. He sat with that. Why are you telling me now? He said. Because what's coming for you is going to come regardless of what I do or don't say, and I don't want it to come faster than it would naturally because someone deliberately accelerated it. That's not the same thing as helping you. I want to be clear about that. I understand the distinction. Make sure you do, because I have separated from this organization in every legal sense, and that separation is complete, and there's nothing in what I'm telling you now that changes that. I'm telling you because it's the accurate picture, and because you're going to need to understand the full scope of what happened inside your organization if you're going to manage what comes next. He thought about asking her to come back. He didn't ask because he knew the answer, and because asking would cost him something he wasn't prepared to spend. Who placed her? He said instead. I don't know with certainty. My best assessment is someone from inside the investment structure of the Castellan Group. Someone who wanted the organizational intelligence that a person in her position would have access to, and who also wanted to accelerate the deterioration of the operational management, which was already going to deteriorate when I left, but would deteriorate faster if I left while the organization was simultaneously being mined for sensitive data. A pause. That's a sophisticated play. That's not a Lester Webb play. That's someone who understands the whole board. Who in the Castellan investor structure? That's the question you need to answer, she said. And you need to answer it in the next 30 days, before the SEC deadline, because whoever it is, they know about the deadline, and they're betting you can't meet it. He thought about the 45 days. Now he thought about it differently, not as a regulatory inconvenience, but as a component of a larger move. Someone had watched the organization, had identified its key structural vulnerability, had introduced a person into his household who could accelerate the exposure of that vulnerability, had simultaneously moved on the Pittsburgh deal to fracture his alliance structure, and had then waited for the regulatory deadline to land. It was, he thought with a nauseating clarity, an extraordinarily well-planned operation. One more thing, Claire said. He waited. The notebook, she said. I know you've been looking for it. I want to be clear about what's in it. It's 9 years of management notes, organizational decisions, financial architecture, relationship documentation. All of it relates to the legitimate side of the business. None of it crosses into the other side. I was deliberate about that because I understood that keeping those records clean was necessary for my own legal protection. Where is it? With my attorneys. Which attorneys? Mine, she said. A pause. The notes are protective documentation for my own position, she said. They demonstrate my role in the organization, the nature and scope of my contributions, the fact that I was the operational architect of the legitimate structure. They're not a weapon against you. They're armor for me. There's a difference. That's a distinction that depends entirely on what investigation subsequently finds, he said. Yes, she said. It is. Another silence. In the ambient noise of her office, he heard something. A door closing, a voice, the muffled quality of a space where other things were happening. If someone has been mining your organization's intelligence and is now positioned to use the Castellan documentation request as leverage, she said, then your most urgent problem isn't the SEC. Your most urgent problem is figuring out who inside your investor structure is running that play. Because whatever they're building toward, the SEC deadline is a mechanism, not the goal. The goal is something else. She ended the call. He sat in the library with the phone in his hand. He sat there for 11 minutes. He could tell because the library clock was analog, and he watched the minute hand move, which was the kind of thing a man does when the thing he needs to think about is too large to approach directly, and so he finds a peripheral point to anchor himself. Then he called Frank. The Castellan investor list, he said. Every LP. I need a full profile on each of them. Movement in the last 6 months. Financial activity, organizational changes, new personnel, anything that looks like they've been building position. That's a long list, Frank said. I know. Who am I looking for? Someone sophisticated, someone who's been watching the organization's management structure and identified the dependency on Claire. Someone who either knew she was going to leave or decided to accelerate it. A pause. You think someone inside the investor structure was moving against us while I was distracted, Vincent said. Yes. He could hear Frank processing that. I'll start tonight. He ended the call. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The Connecticut property was doing what it always did in November. Gray and bare and vast in the specific way that expensive land is vast, the kind of vastness that announces money rather than wilderness. He had stood at this window many times over the years and felt, in this view, the solidity of what he'd built. Today, the view looked like something else. It looked like the exterior of a structure whose interior was considerably more compromised than it appeared from the outside. He went to the kitchen and poured coffee that had been sitting since morning. It was cold. He drank it cold because he had stopped caring about that particular category of comfort. He stood at the kitchen island where Sabrina had stood that morning with her arms around him, and her knowledge of his organizational files, and her cousin in municipal contracting, and her designed-to-be-discovered interference in his business. And he thought about 30 years of building something that he had believed was impenetrable. He thought about impenetrability. He thought about the specific, quiet, invisible way the thing had been penetrated. Not by violence, not by federal investigation, not by a rival family's direct assault, but by a sequence of decisions he had made himself, small and large, over many years. The decision to not put Claire's name on anything, the decision to not pay her, to not acknowledge her authority, to operate as though the intelligence that sustained the organization was his own rather than hers. The decision to bring Sabrina into the house and give her access to the drive. The decision to treat the gala as the appropriate venue for a public declaration of where his attention had moved. Each of those decisions had seemed, at the time, like a decision about something small. Together they had produced this. He was standing at the kitchen island with cold coffee when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, Virginia area code, different from the one Claire had called from. The text said, "Check the Castellan fund documents. The March 2022 capital call. The co-signatory on the transfer authorization." He stared at the text. He called Gerald. "The March 2022 capital call for Castellan," he said. "The transfer authorization document. Who was the co-signatory?" He could hear Gerald pulling files, papers rustling, the sound of a man who kept physical records because he trusted paper more than systems. "Transfer authorization, March 2022, Gerald said. "Co-signatory is... That's odd." "What?" "The co-signatory is listed as C. Sutton, but the transfer authorization should have had a second organizational signatory. The operating agreement required 2 signatories for transfers over $5 million. A pause. "Vincent, the transfer was for $8,200,000. The second signatory is... I'm looking at the signature here. This is not a name I recognize. The signature is... It reads as R. Harlan." "Who is R. Harlan?" "That's what I'm saying. I don't recognize this name from any organizational document. It's not in my files as an authorized signatory for Castellan." He stood very still at the kitchen island. "Pull the authorization document completely, every name on it, everything." "I'm pulling it now." The sound of pages. "The transfer date is March 17th, 2022. The receiving account is... This is a Cayman account. I don't have this account in my records for Castellan. This account is not in my records anywhere." He put the coffee cup down. $8,200,000 went to an account you don't have records for. In March of 2022, and the co-signatory is someone I've never heard of. A pause, and Gerald's voice had changed, had acquired the specific quality of a man who has been a careful attorney for 30 years and has just encountered something that makes that carefulness feel like it may not have been careful enough. "Vincent, if this is what I think it is, someone used Claire's signatory authority, her legitimate documented authority on this entity, to move organizational money to an account that has no organizational paper trail. Using a forged second signature," Vincent said. "I don't know if it's forged. That's what we need to determine." "It's forged," Vincent said, "because Claire didn't do this. Claire didn't move money to a Cayman account she didn't document." He was certain of this with the same certainty he'd felt when he'd said he knew her, and this time the certainty was not a comfort but a specific targeted horror. Because if Claire hadn't done it and the co-signatory was fabricated, then what existed was a document that had Claire's legitimate signature on an unauthorized transfer, a document that Claire did not know existed, a document that was sitting in the Castellan fund records in a file that an SEC investigation would eventually reach. Someone had used her name. Someone had used the authority she'd built and maintained and documented across 9 years, had taken her legitimate signature on a legitimate document, had added a fabricated co-signatory beneath it, and had moved $8 million out of the fund to an account that would take investigators months to trace. And when they traced it, her name would be the first name on the authorization. He called the Virginia number that had sent the text. It went immediately to a recording that said the number was not in service. He opened his laptop and pulled up the Castellan fund records in the organizational system. The system the IT firms were still working to decode. He typed the date, March 17, 2022. He found the capital call documentation. He opened the transfer authorization. Claire Sutton's signature was there. Her real signature, the one he recognized from 11 years of watching her sign documents at the kitchen table in the morning and in the library in the evenings and in hotels and offices and conference rooms across the legitimate side of the organization. Beneath it was a second signature that read, R. Harlan, in a hand he had never seen before. And at the bottom of the document, in the metadata field that captured the login session in which the document had been generated, was an access timestamp. The document had been created in the organizational system on March 16, 2022, under Claire's login credentials. But Claire had been in Sardinia on March 16, 2022. He knew this because he had sent her to Sardinia to manage a property acquisition on that date, a trip that had lasted 4 days, a trip he had not joined, a trip during which someone with access to her organizational login had generated a transfer authorization document in her name, signed it with a fabricated second signature, and moved $8 million to a Cayman account. The meeting room in which this had happened, the session had been accessed from the estate's main network, from inside this house. He sat with this for a long time. Someone inside the organization, someone with access to the estate's network, someone who knew Claire's login credentials, had executed this transfer while she was out of the country, had placed her name on an unauthorized document, and had then left the document in the fund's records in a position where it would either remain invisible for years or become devastating the moment a federal investigation began pulling at the organizational thread. It would become devastating regardless of Claire's departure. Her departure hadn't created this exposure. Her departure had simply removed the person who, as long as she remained inside the organization, might eventually have found it. And now she was outside the organization. And in 45 days, the SEC was going to request the Castellan documentation. And when they received it, they were going to find a transfer authorization with her name on it, her real signature, her login credentials, a document she had never seen and never authorized, and that had been created while she was on an island in the Mediterranean. He needed to call her. He needed to call her before she learned about this from anyone else, before her attorneys found it in the documentation they were reviewing, before it became something that existed in the world without her being prepared for it. He called the number she'd called from. It rang 6 times. She picked up. There's something in the Castellan records, he said. A transfer authorization for March 2022. Your signature is on it. Silence. You were in Sardinia, he said. March 16th. Someone generated the document from the estate network under your credentials while you were out of the country. The silence on the other end of the line was the specific silence of someone processing information that is simultaneously surprising and in some part of their mind not entirely surprising. So the silence of someone whose existing suspicion has been confirmed at a magnitude they hadn't fully anticipated. How much, she said. 8,200,000. Cayman account. Yes. Do you know who R. Harlan is? She said. No. I do, she said. And the way she said it, flat, precise, carrying the weight of something that had been carried for a while in a private place, told him that she had known, or had suspected, or had found something in the 9 years of notebook entries that she had been reviewing with her attorneys that had pointed her toward a name she hadn't yet been ready to surface. Who is it? He said. She didn't answer immediately. He heard her breathing. He heard the ambient quality of her office change. A door, footsteps, the sound of someone entering the space she was in. Then a voice he didn't recognize said something in the background, and Claire said, "I have to go." "Claire, don't call this number again," she said. "And Vincent, get Gerald to pull every transfer authorization with a co-signatory he doesn't recognize. Everyone. March 2022 is not the only one." She ended the call. He sat in the library with the phone in his hand and the Castellan document on the screen and $8 million in a Cayman account that had his organization's money in it, and Claire's name on the authorization and the SEC deadline 45 days out. Not the only one. He called Gerald back and told him to pull every transfer authorization in the Castellan records with an unrecognized co-signatory. Gerald said he'd call back within the hour. Gerald called back in 40 minutes. 4 documents, Gerald said. His voice had the quality of a man who has found something in a wall that was not supposed to be there and is now dealing with the smell. 4 transfer authorizations with the R. Harlan co-signature. Total value across the 4 transfers is $31,800,000. He did not say anything. All of them were generated during periods when Claire's system access logs show she was away from the estate. All of them have her legitimate signature, which means someone with access to her signed documents was reproducing her signature physically because the system doesn't capture digital signatures, it captures scanned documents uploaded to the record. 31 million, he said, to 3 separate Cayman accounts. All 3 are in the fund records as though they were legitimate authorized transfers. And the SEC request covers these records. The SEC request covers the entire fund documentation for the last 5 years, Gerald said. Yes. He sat in the library and he understood, with the final settled clarity of a man who has run out of angles to consider, the complete shape of what had been done to him. Not by Claire, not by a rival family, not by federal investigators who had built a case against him over years, by someone inside his own structure, someone who had been in proximity to the estate, with access to the network, with knowledge of Claire's travel schedule, with the specific sophisticated understanding of the fund's documentation systems to generate transfer authorizations that had sat undiscovered in the records for 2 to 3 years. $31 million gone. Claire's name on all of it. 45 days until the SEC pulled the records. And somewhere, in a registered office in Virginia, or on a call in Washington, or in the careful, deliberate movement of a woman who had spent 9 years learning how to be invisible and was now learning how to be seen, Claire Sutton was sitting with a name she hadn't given him yet. A name in a notebook filled with 9 years of everything, looking at the same shape he was looking at from the opposite direction. He thought about what she'd said on the first call. The goal is something else. He picked up the phone. He called a number he had not called in 3 years, a number that belonged to a man named Paul Dreiser, who worked for the Eastern District U.S. Attorney's Office as a senior investigator and who had, 3 years ago, approached him through an intermediary about a cooperation arrangement that he had declined. The phone rang twice. Paul Dreiser picked up and said, "Vincent Morelli." "I need a conversation," Vincent said. A pause. "About what?" "About $31 million, and whose name is on it," he said. "And about what I can tell you that's worth more than what you can currently prove." Paul Dreiser had an office in the federal building on Main Street in Hartford that looked like every federal office that had ever existed. Gray carpet, fluorescent ceiling panels, a window that faced a parking structure, stacks of files that had been arranged by someone who understood their contents, but not their optics. He was 56, lean, with the specific unhurried quality of a man who had spent 30 years waiting for people to make mistakes, and had learned that patience was more productive than pressure. He had been waiting for Vincent Morelli for 3 years. He did not let that show when Vincent came through the door on a Tuesday morning with Gerald Posen and a criminal defense attorney named Catherine Voss, who had flown up from New York the previous evening and who had spent the drive from the hotel to the federal building telling Vincent, with the clipped precision of someone who charged by the minute and meant every word of it, exactly what he would say and exactly what he would not say, and what the parameters of any arrangement would need to look like before she would allow him to say anything at all. Dreiser had 2 investigators in the room with him. He also had a woman Vincent didn't recognize. 40s, dark suit, the specific quality of stillness that Vincent, associated with people who listened for a living and had gotten very good at it. He looked at the woman. Eleanor Tate, Dreiser said. She's with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FinCEN, not SEC. Something had moved faster than Vincent had expected. Catherine Voss said, "My client is here voluntarily to provide information relevant to an ongoing matter. Before anything is said, I need written confirmation of the immunity parameters we discussed." Dreiser slid a document across the table. Catherine read it. She made 2 annotations in the margin in ballpoint pen. She slid it back. Dreiser read the annotations, looked at Eleanor Tate, received a small nod, and initialed both margins. Catherine said, "Go ahead, Vincent." He talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He told them about the Castellan Fund. He told them about the 4 transfer authorizations, the R. Harlan co-signature, the Cayman accounts. He told them about the March 2022 transfer and where Claire had been, and the estate network access log, and the fact that someone with physical access to the property had reproduced her signature on documents she had never seen. He told them about Sabrina Hale, her real name, which was not Sabrina Hale, which Carl Diaz had found 48 hours earlier after running a deeper identity check that revealed a social security number that had been issued to a Renata Halverson of Bridgeport, Connecticut, who had 2 prior addresses that included a building in New Haven, whose other tenants included a man named Douglas Crew, who was a financial analyst who had left the Castellan Group's investment advisory board in 2021 under circumstances that had not been publicly disclosed. Eleanor Tate leaned forward when he said Douglas Crew's name. Just slightly, just enough. He saw it. "You know that name," he said. "Keep going," she said. He told them what he had. He told them what he suspected. He told them what Claire had told him, that she had a name, that she hadn't given it to him, that the text from the Virginia number had directed him to the March 2022 document, and that whoever had sent that text knew the fund records well enough to know exactly where to point him. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Eleanor Tate said, "The Cayman accounts, all 3 of them. We've been watching those accounts for 14 months. He felt the air go out of the room. 14 months, he said. The first flag came through a partner agency. The accounts received transfers that we believed at the time were connected to a separate matter, a financial structuring case involving a Cayman-registered holding company with ties to 2 investment funds. We traced the funds. Castellan was one of them." She paused. "We've known about the transfers for over a year. We didn't know the mechanism. We didn't know who inside the fund had authorized them. The authorization documents in the fund's records were produced to us via subpoena 6 months ago, and we've been working to authenticate them since." "You've had Claire's name for 6 months," he said. "We've had a signature we couldn't authenticate for 6 months," she said precisely. "We don't make assumptions about signatures." Catherine Voss's hand found his arm. A light touch. A warning. "The person you need to speak with," Vincent said, "is not me." Tate looked at him. "Claire Sutton," he said, "formerly Claire Morelli. She has documentation of her travel on March 16, 2022. She has 9 years of organizational records that will tell you more about the management structure of that fund than anything I can give you. And she has a name that she didn't give me." He stopped. "She's been building toward this conversation too. She just hasn't gotten here yet." Tate and Dreiser exchanged a look that lasted less than a second and contained a full conversation. "We'll be in touch," Dreiser said. He left the federal building at 12:40 with Catherine walking half a step behind him, and she said, when they were through the lobby doors and in the parking structure's cold concrete air, "You understand that whatever protection the immunity arrangement gives you is contingent on the information being complete and accurate." "It's complete," he said, "and accurate." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment with the flat professional assessment of a woman who had sat across from people in worse situations than this and learned to read the difference between men who were telling the truth and men who were managing their version of it. Whatever she found in his face, she said, "All right." He drove back to the estate alone. The day had turned cold in the way November turns cold in Connecticut. Not gradually, but decisively. A drop in temperature that made the air feel like a different substance than it had been the day before. He drove with the heat off because he needed the cold, needed the specific sharpness of it to keep his mind from slipping into the kind of circling that wasn't productive. He had given them Douglas Crew. He had given them the Cayman accounts. He had given them Renata Halverson, whose access to his house and his organizational files had been deliberate and placed, and who had been gone for 6 days now, and whose location Carl could not determine, which was itself information. She had known. She had known the federal interest in the Castellan accounts was building, had known the timeline was closing, and had left before the walls came in. Someone had told her to leave. Someone had been tracking the federal investigation's progression closely enough to know when the window was closing. Douglas Crew. He needed to find Douglas Crew before Crew knew Vincent had spoken to Dreiser. He called Carl from the car. "Crew," he said. "Douglas Crew. Former Castellan board member, left in 2021. I need him located, now, not tomorrow." "I'm on it," Carl said. "Carl." "Yeah. When you find him, don't approach. Call me directly." He ended the call. He was 20 minutes from the estate when his phone rang. Number he didn't recognize, different Virginia area code from the one Claire had used before. He picked up. "You talked to Dreiser this morning." It was Claire's voice, flat and fast. "Yes." "They move faster than I expected." A pause. He could hear her moving. The sound of heels on a hard floor, a door, the ambient shift from an open space to something enclosed. "Crew has been in contact with a lawyer in the last 48 hours. Someone told him movement was happening." "Who told him?" "I don't know, but if he lawyers up and moves assets in the next 72 hours, the Cayman accounts go cold. The money was structured to move. It's not sitting still. It was always designed to be mobile. If Crew initiates the transfer sequence, Tate loses the accounts, and what you gave them becomes circumstantial." He processed this. "How do you know about the transfer sequence?" A pause. Brief, but specific. "Because I found the structure documents in the Castellan records 14 months ago, and I've been building the legal case for my own protection ever since. The transfer sequence is documented. It's in the notebook." "The notebook your attorneys have?" "Yes." "Claire, I'm calling you because Tate needs the transfer sequence documentation before Crew moves. I can get it to her directly, but it needs to happen today, and it needs to happen through a channel that doesn't go through you because you've just entered a cooperation arrangement, and anything you touch is going to get scrutinized for whether it was produced to help yourself rather than produced because it's accurate." He understood what she was saying. She was going to Tate independently. She was going to hand over the notebook documentation independently on her own timeline for her own reasons. She was telling him because she needed him to not interfere, not to make contact with Tate between now and when she got there, not to add anything that would contaminate the chain. "Okay," he said. "Don't call me again after this," she said. "Whatever happens next, it goes through the legal process, not through you and me talking." "I understand." "And Vincent." A pause, and in the pause he heard something that wasn't quite emotion, but was in the vicinity of it, the sound of someone allowing 1 degree of the controlled surface to become briefly permeable. "The transfers, the forged documents. I didn't know. I want you to hear me say that directly. I didn't know." "I know you didn't." "Okay," she said. She ended the call. He put the phone on the passenger seat. He drove. The Connecticut landscape moved past the windows. The bare trees, the late November fields, the specific gray light that made everything look like it was made of the same material. He thought about her on the phone to Elaine Marsh's office, or in a car somewhere, or in the Arlington address that Sutton Meridian listed as its registered location, calling Tate's office to arrange a meeting. He thought about her walking into a federal building with a notebook and 9 years of documentation and the specific, unhurried quality of a woman who had been preparing for this meeting for considerably longer than anyone realized. He thought about the gala, about Sabrina, Renata, walking in through the side door with her hand on his back, laughing at something he'd said. He thought about how long she'd been inside the house before that night, how many evenings she had spent in the organizational drive while he was in another room, how many documents she had opened, read, photographed, how many times she had sat at the kitchen island while he talked about business and committed the contents of those conversations to whatever record she was maintaining for Douglas Crew. He thought about the thing Claire had said in the library doorway the night she came back downstairs with her hair cut short, the way she'd matched his tone, the way she'd said his name back to him. He understood now that in that moment she had already known most of what he was only learning today. She had known about Renata and the probable intelligence operation. She had known about the document structure that would eventually lead to the Cayman accounts. She had known her own name was on a transfer authorization she hadn't authorized. She had known all of it and had made the decision that the correct move was not to tell him, because telling him would have locked her back into the architecture of a relationship she had already decided to leave, would have made her the person who saved him again, in the way she had been saving things for 9 years without acknowledgement. She had decided that this time the saving was going to happen on different terms. He pulled into the estate. Carl called at 3:15. "Crew," he said, he's in Westport. He has a house there. It's registered to a holding company, but we traced it. He's been there for at least 3 days. His car is in the driveway." "Alone?" "Unclear. There's at least one other vehicle registered to the same holding company that's been at the property. I can get closer to—" "No," Vincent said. "Don't get closer. I need to know if he's making calls. Can you get his call traffic? I can get metadata, not content. Get it." He ended the call. He went to the library and sat at the desk and looked at the organizational system on his laptop and thought about Douglas Crew. Crew had left the Castellan board in 2021, officially due to a conflict of interest that had been handled quietly and had not generated any public record. The departure had been managed, he knew that now, knew it in retrospect, by someone who wanted Crew out of an official position and into an unofficial one, a position from which he could continue to operate inside the fund's financial structure without any legal accountability for what he was doing there. The $31 million hadn't gone to Crew. That was the thing Vincent needed to understand. The accounts were receiving entities, staging points. The money had moved again from those accounts. Tate had said the accounts had been flagged 14 months ago, which meant the money had been in the accounts and had moved on. To where? He didn't know. Tate didn't tell him. Maybe Tate didn't know. Maybe the notebook Claire was carrying to Tate's office today had the answer. He thought about $31 million. He thought about the other investors in the Castellan fund, the legitimate ones, the pension fund from a Hartford insurance company, the family office from a Boston real estate group, 2 individual high-net-worth investors who had come in through referrals, and 3 other entities whose beneficial ownership he now, sitting at the desk in the library with the November light dying outside the window, realized he had never personally verified. 3 entities. He had trusted the fund's due diligence process. He had trusted Claire to verify it. But Claire had been managing the legitimate structure in good faith, had been doing what she believed was proper due diligence, had not had reason to believe that someone inside the fund's governance structure was inserting entities designed to move money through the fund's accounts and out through transfer authorizations they had fraudulently generated in her name. He pulled up the 3 entity records in the system. 2 of them resolved cleanly. He could trace the beneficial ownership through the documentation. The 3rd was a Cayman-registered investment entity called Harlan Capital Partners. R. Harlan. Harlan Capital Partners was an investor in the Castellan Fund. The name on the fraudulent co-signature was R. Harlan. The investor and the co-signatory were the same fabricated identity. A closed loop, a self-authorizing mechanism built directly into the fund structure, designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for the connection between the investor entity and the signature block. He picked up the phone and called Catherine Voss. "Harlan Capital Partners," he said when she answered. "It's an investor in the Castellan Fund. Cayman registered. The co-signatory on the fraudulent transfers is R. Harlan. The entity and the signature are the same fabrication. It's a closed loop. The fund's records show Harlan Capital as a legitimate investor, which gave the signature apparent authority." A pause. "Vincent, you need to stop talking to me about the substance of this and let me do my job. Send me the entity records, tonight." "I'm sending them now." He forwarded the records from the system. He sat back in the chair. He called Carl again. "Crew's calls, any movement." 4 outbound calls in the last 2 hours. 1 to a number registered to a law firm in Stamford. 1 to a Cayman number. 2 to a number that's bouncing, prepaid or some kind of routing service. The Cayman call. "What time was the Cayman call?" 1:47. 1:47. 40 minutes after he had walked out of Dreiser's office, someone had told Crew that Vincent had been to the federal building, someone who had been watching the federal building, or someone who had a contact inside it. He sat forward in the chair. He called Dreiser directly. Dreiser picked up on the third ring. "Mr. Morelli." Formal. Careful. "Someone told Crew I was in your office this morning. He made a Cayman call at 1:47. Silence. Brief and hard. "I'm telling you because if he initiates a transfer sequence in the next 24 to 48 hours, you lose the accounts," Vincent said. "And I'm telling you because I want you to understand I gave you everything I have and I need you to move on Crew before he moves the money." Dreiser said, "I'm aware of the timeline." "Then you're aware of the source problem." Another silence. "I'm aware of everything you've just said. I'll handle it from this end." A pause. "Mr. Morelli, is there anything else you want to add to what you provided this morning?" "Harlan Capital Partners," he said. "It's a Cayman entity. It's listed as an investor in the Castellan Fund, and the beneficial co-signatory on the fraudulent transfers uses the same name. The entity created its own authorization loop." He could hear Dreiser writing. "Eleanor Tate is also going to receive documentation from a separate source today," he said. "A source that is independent of me and that has physical documentation of the transfer sequence. I'm telling you this so you know it's coming and from whom." "From whom?" Dreiser said. "Claire Sutton." He ended the call. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. Outside, the estate's security lights had come on. It was past 4, the November dark arriving early, the property going from gray to black at the edges. He could see Carl's car near the gate, the overnight security starting their positions. He thought about what happened next. He thought about it with the same quality of assessment he'd used for 30 years in situations where the landscape had changed and the previous map was no longer reliable. The federal process was moving now. He had set it moving. Claire was feeding it from the other side. Tate had 14 months of account surveillance, and Catherine Voss was filing documents tonight that would reconstruct the Harlan Capital loop for the investigators. Crew was in Westport. The money was somewhere past the Cayman accounts. Renata Halverson was gone. His phone buzzed. A text from Carl. It said, "Second vehicle left the Westport property 4:12 p.m. Female driver. I have a partial plate." He replied, "Run it." He stood at the window and watched the security lights hold the perimeter of the estate in their flat white illumination, and he thought about 30 years and what they had built and what had been built inside them without his knowledge. He thought about the specific kind of blindness that power produces. The way that being feared had made him stop needing to see clearly, had made other people's perception of him a substitute for actual visibility. His phone buzzed again. Carl. The text read, "Plate comes back to a rental. Rented 2 days ago to a Sabrina Hale, credit card in that name." She was still using the Sabrina Hale identity. He called Carl. "She left 2 days after I told her to go," he said. "She's been in Westport with Crew." "What do you want me to do?" He thought about it. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "Call Dreiser's office," he said. "Give them the rental information and the Westport address. Tell them who the female driver is and that she left the property at 4:12 and give them the partial plate." A pause. "You want me to call the feds?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. Carl had been with the organization for 14 years, and this was, in those 14 years, the first time Vincent had given him that instruction, and they both understood the weight of what it contained and what it didn't contain and what it meant that Vincent was giving it now. "Okay," Carl said. He ended the call. He turned from the window and looked at the library. The desk, the files, the organizational laptop, the cold coffee from earlier still on the corner of the desk. He looked at all of it with the clear vision of someone who has stopped needing it to mean something different from what it means. His phone rang. "Frank." "Vincent," Frank said, and the quality of his voice was the specific quality of a man who has just received information and is calculating how to deliver it. "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "The Ancelotti brothers. Marco called me an hour ago. He said they're pulling out of the Pittsburgh arrangement entirely. He said the family had a meeting last night and they've decided the Morelli organization's current situation creates too much exposure for a joint venture. A pause. He was polite about it. He said it wasn't personal. It's never personal, Vincent thought. In this world, it's always personal and always called something else. Okay, he said. Eddie called too. The Hartford licensing, we got a 30-day extension on the documentation request. But Eddie says he's not sure he can get the package complete even with 30 days because the way Claire built the system. I know, he said. And Steve says the March property closings. 2 of the 3 buyers have requested extensions because their attorneys flagged some structural questions in the SAW. Frank, yeah. Stop. Frank stopped. I need you to do one thing, Vincent said. Pull the financial statements for the Castellan Fund for the last 3 years, all of them. Put them in a secure physical file. Lock it in your office. Don't send them anywhere electronically. Don't make copies. Don't discuss them with anyone except Catherine Voss. Can you do that tonight? Yes, Frank said. Do it now. He ended the call. He stood in the library for a moment in the specific kind of quiet that accumulates when the walls of something are beginning to come in. Not the dramatic sudden collapse. The other kind. The slow, structural kind that announces itself first as absence. The absence of certainty. The absence of the familiar weight of an intact system. The absence of the 11-year architecture that had been holding the whole structure in its correct relationship to gravity. He poured the cold coffee out in the small bathroom off the library. He rinsed the cup. He filled it with water from the tap and stood at the sink drinking it, which was a thing he never did. He drank from glasses, from crystal, not from a coffee cup at a bathroom sink, but he was doing it now because the ordinary category of things had shifted and he was operating in a different register. He went back to the desk. He opened the organizational system. He looked at Claire's name in the search field, 843 documents. He looked at the first result, which was a licensing agreement for one of the construction subsidiaries, dated March 2017, authored by C. Morelli, and he thought about March 2017, which was a month he could barely recall the specifics of, and he thought about what Claire had been doing in March 2017. What she had been building, what she had been maintaining, what she had been producing while he had been doing whatever he had been doing that month that he could not now recall. His phone lit up. A text from an unknown number. No area code. International format. The text said, Mr. Morelli, my name is Douglas Crew. I think we should talk before this goes any further. I have information about Claire Sutton that federal investigators don't have, and that changes the picture significantly. I can meet you tonight. Come alone. He looked at the text for a long time. He looked at it long enough that the library clock moved 3 full minutes. Then he typed a reply. The reply said, Where? Crew wanted to meet at a marina in Westport. He sent the address 20 minutes after Vincent replied, with a time, 9 p.m., and no other information. Vincent sat with the text for a long moment, then called Catherine Voss and read her the exchange verbatim. She said, Do not go. He said, I'm going. Vincent. He has something on Claire. Something he believes changes the picture. I need to know what it is before he gives it to someone else or destroys it. If he has something on Claire, that's Claire's problem to manage, not yours. You're in the middle of a federal cooperation arrangement. If you meet with Crew tonight and it becomes known, then I'll tell Dreiser I'm meeting him, he said. I'll tell him exactly what the text said and exactly where I'm going. A long pause. You'd be wearing a wire. Yes. That changes the calculus, she said slowly, but I want it documented that I advised against this. Documented, he said. He called Dreiser at 6:15. Dreiser listened to the full account of the text exchange without interrupting. When Vincent finished, Dreiser was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted them, the way he'd started counting things, a habit of precision he was developing in the wreckage of his former certainty. We'll have people at the marina, Dreiser said. Don't initiate anything. Don't ask leading questions. Let him say what he came to say. He arrived at the marina at 8:52. It was a private facility, gated, the kind of place that costs money to berth a boat and costs more to ask questions at. The November air off the water was sharp enough to make his eyes ache. He wore the wire under his coat and he felt it against his sternum with every breath, a small pressure, a reminder of what this meeting was and wasn't. Crew was already there. He was standing at the end of a dock between two covered boats, a man in his late 50s, heavier than his Castellan board photo suggested, with the gray look of someone who had been under pressure for longer than his body was designed to handle. He was wearing a coat too thin for the temperature. His hands were in his pockets, and he was watching Vincent walk toward him with the specific stillness of a man who has decided on a posture and is holding it by will. Vincent stopped 6 feet away. The water moved under the dock, a faint creak of lines against cleats. Otherwise quiet. "You went to Dreiser," Crew said. Not an accusation, a statement. "Yes." Crew nodded. He looked at the water. "How much did you give them?" "Everything I had." "Harlan Capital." "Yes." Crew absorbed this. He pulled one hand from his pocket and rubbed his face with it. A gesture of exhaustion, the movement of a man who had been managing something at extreme effort for a very long time and had reached the point where the effort was no longer producing returns. "I didn't take the money," Crew said. "I want you to understand that. The accounts were passed through. The money went through and kept moving. I was managing the structure, not the destination." "Who was managing the destination?" Crew looked at him. "That's what I have." "Then tell me." Crew pulled his other hand from his pocket. He was holding a flash drive, small, black, the ordinary kind sold at any electronics retailer. He held it at his side. "This is everything," he said. "The full transfer sequence. Every account the money moved through after the Cayman stage, the final destination accounts, and their beneficial owners." He paused. "It ends with 2 accounts. One belongs to a holding entity controlled by a man named Harlan Goss. He runs a private equity firm in Boston. He's been positioning to acquire the Castellan Fund's primary assets at distressed prices. Assets that are only available at distressed prices if the fund collapses under a fraud investigation." Vincent stood very still. He manufactured the fraud investigation. He manufactured the documentation of fraud. The transfers were real. The money moved. But the paper trail was designed to implicate your fund's management structure, specifically the person who had the clearest signatory authority, and trigger a regulatory event that would devalue the assets for acquisition. "Claire," Vincent said. "Claire," Crew confirmed. Her name, her signature, her credentials. She was the cleanest target. No title, no official position, maximum operational exposure. If she went down as the fraudulent signatory, the fund collapses. Assets go to distressed sale. Goss acquires at 30 cents on the dollar. A pause. "I built the structure. I didn't know the full end game when I started. When I understood it, I was already inside it far enough that there was no clean exit." "So you're giving me this," Vincent said. "I'm giving Dreiser this," Crew said. "You're just the delivery mechanism." He held out the flash drive. "The second account on the drive, the second beneficial owner, is Renata Halverson. She took $800,000 as a fee. She's not gone. She's in a hotel in Stamford. I can give you the hotel." He took the flash drive. He held it in his hand and felt its negligible weight and thought about $31 million and Claire's name on 4 documents and a man in Boston who had spent 2 years engineering a collapse he intended to profit from. "Why?" Vincent said. "Why are you giving this up?" Crew looked at the water for a moment. His jaw moved. "Because Goss stopped returning my calls 4 days ago," he said. "Because I built this whole structure and the man who was supposed to take care of me when it was done has decided I'm a liability instead of an asset." He stopped. "And because the woman whose name I put on those documents, I've been reading about her, her company, what she's been building. She didn't do anything to deserve being the person who takes the fall for this." The water moved. The dock creaked. "That's not enough," Vincent said. Crew looked at him. "That's not enough of a reason," Vincent said. "It's not enough that she doesn't deserve it. You knew that 2 years ago." Crew said nothing. He looked at the black water between the boats, and he had the expression of a man looking at an accurate reflection and finding it difficult to hold the gaze. He didn't argue. That was the closest thing to honest Vincent had seen from anyone in weeks, and he understood it for what it was. Not remorse, exactly, but the specific acknowledgement that comes when a man has run out of the energy required to maintain a version of himself that is better than what he's actually done. Go home, Vincent said. Stay there. When Dreiser calls, pick up. He walked back down the dock without looking back. He called Dreiser from the car. He described the conversation completely. He described the flash drive and its contents as crew had described them. He gave Dreiser the hotel in Stamford and the name Renata Halverson and the name Harlan Goss. He drove to the federal building and handed the flash drive to a duty agent at 11:20 p.m. and signed a chain of custody form under Catherine Voss's remote authorization via phone. He drove back to the estate at midnight. He did not feel like a man who had won anything. He felt like a man standing in the wreckage of a building he had constructed badly, looking at the materials clearly for the first time, understanding with architectural precision exactly where every wrong decision had been made, and knowing that understanding it now was useful only insofar as it informed what came next, not as a consolation for what had already fallen. He went to the library. He turned on the desk lamp. He sat. He did not open the laptop. He sat in the lamplight for a long time, and he thought about Claire, not strategically, not as a component of what was unfolding legally and federally and organizationally, but as a person. As the person who had sat in this library in the early years working at the other desk, the smaller one he'd eventually moved out when he needed more filing space, working in the evenings after dinner on things he hadn't asked about and hadn't thought to ask about. As the person who had carried a notebook for 9 years and filled it with the operational intelligence of an empire she hadn't owned and wasn't named in. As the person who had stood at an east window at her own anniversary party and matched his tone back to him without flinching and then gone upstairs and cut her hair with a pair of dressmaking shears and sent a text that said Thursday to a number she'd memorized rather than stored. He thought about the kind of precision that required. He thought about the kind of person that required. He turned off the desk lamp. He went to bed. He slept for the first time in weeks, without lying awake running calculations. 3 months later, the Harlan Goss indictment came down on a Wednesday morning. 14 counts, wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, money laundering. Douglas Crew entered a plea agreement the same day. Renata Halverson had been arrested in Stamford 12 days after the Marina meeting. Her hotel room containing 2 laptops, a burner phone with 43 messages to a Cayman routing number, and $800,000 in wire transfer confirmations that matched the secondary account on the flash drive exactly. The Castellan Fund did not survive. The institutional investors recovered a portion of their capital through the bankruptcy process. The Morelli organization's legitimate holdings, what remained of them, were sold off over the following 8 months, through a court-supervised process that Catherine Voss managed with the specific efficiency of someone who charged by the hour and had no sentimentality about what the assets had once represented. The criminal side of the organization faced its own separate federal process, the parameters of which the cooperation arrangement had defined, and which Vincent moved through with the same focused absence of illusion he'd developed in the library on the night he drove home from the marina. He was not imprisoned. The cooperation arrangement held. He lost nearly everything else. He moved out of the estate in April. He took the things that were specifically his, a few pieces of furniture, some books, the clothing. He left the crystal, the marble, the imported stone floors, the 14-foot ceilings. He left the photograph of Sardinia on the wall in the sitting room because he looked at it on the last morning and decided it belonged to a version of things that no longer existed, and he didn't want to carry it. He rented an apartment in Hartford. It was on the 4th floor of a building that had been a textile mill and had been converted sometime in the 90s. The ceilings were 10 feet, which felt low to him at first, and then, gradually, didn't. He heard about Sutton Meridian the way he heard about most things now, through ordinary channels, public information, the news that reached a person who was no longer inside the room where things were decided. A profile in a business publication in February. A brief mention in a financial sector newsletter about a firm that had completed a significant advisory engagement with a logistics company in the Southeast. A photograph attached to a brief announcement of an industry award of a woman in a dark jacket standing in front of what appeared to be an office interior, her short hair neat, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has decided exactly how much of themselves to allow into a professional photograph. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put his phone face down on the table and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the Hartford street below, where ordinary people were doing ordinary things in the March cold. He did not contact her. He had understood, since the night at the marina, that there was a correct relationship to maintain with the choice she had made. And that correct relationship was distance. Not hostility, not the particular performance of wounded dignity. Just the honest acknowledgement that she had built something that existed entirely outside of what he had been. And that reaching toward it, even with the best intentions, even with the genuine remorse that had replaced the more comfortable emotion of anger, would be a form of the same presumption that had defined the 11 years she'd left behind. She was not his to reach toward. She had not been, he now understood, for a very long time. In May, he received a letter, paper, handwritten, in an envelope with a Virginia return address that listed only a suite number and no name. He recognized the handwriting. He had seen it on 9 years of organizational documents and on a photograph of a dessert plate sourced from a Connecticut artisan, and on the daily lists she used to make in the morning in the kitchen, the ones he had never read because he'd assumed they were domestic and therefore not requiring his attention. The letter was 2 paragraphs. He read it standing in the kitchen of the Hartford apartment, his coffee cooling on the counter beside him. The first paragraph said that her attorneys had completed their review of the organizational documentation and that there was no further legal exposure to her from the Castellan situation. That the SEC had issued a formal clarification of her status as a non-culpable party. That Harlan Goss's trial was scheduled for September, and that she had been deposed and would not need to appear in person. That the legal chapter was, for her purposes, closed. The second paragraph said, "I don't write this because I think you need it. I write it because I spent 11 years in proximity to a man who was capable of more than he chose to be, and the gap between those two things was the thing I couldn't survive. I hope the gap gets smaller, not for my sake, for yours." There was no signature, just the handwriting, which was hers, which he knew, which was enough. He folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He finished his coffee. He went to work. A consulting arrangement he'd taken on with a legitimate construction firm that had known him for years and had made the offer with the specific generosity of people who understood that what had happened to him was a compound of his own choices and things that had been done to him, and that both were true simultaneously, and that the question of what a person did after was a different question from the question of how they'd gotten there. He worked. He was not what he'd been. He wasn't trying to be. 260 miles south, in the offices of Sutton Meridian Group on the 8th floor of a building in Arlington, Virginia, with a view of the Potomac through a window that faced west, Claire Sutton was finishing the last document of the afternoon. The office was 7 months old. It had 12 employees now, 3 of them former staff from the Morelli organization's legitimate operations, people who had found her, had found the new company, had reached out with the specific directness of people who had been watching a particular kind of leadership for years and knew what it looked like from the inside when they saw it available somewhere else. She hadn't recruited them. She hadn't needed to. They had come. Elaine was in the adjacent office, on a call. Claire could hear her voice through the shared wall, low, precise, the voice of a woman who had survived 30 years of rooms that hadn't wanted her in them by being better prepared than anyone else in the room. They had developed in the 7 months of the partnership a working rhythm that required very few words because they had found, somewhat to both their surprises, that they processed problems along similar lines and arrived at similar conclusions by different routes, which meant that their disagreements were productive rather than territorial. Claire liked working with someone she disagreed with productively. She finished the document and saved it. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the window and the sky outside, which was the particular blue of a Virginia May evening, the kind of blue that arrived when the spring had fully committed and the heat hadn't yet arrived. She thought about the letter she had sent. She had written it because it was accurate, and accuracy was the standard she held herself to, and the accurate thing was that she did not wish him destruction, had never wished him destruction, had constructed her exit with the specific care of someone who understood the difference between removing herself from a structure and demolishing the structure, even though the structure had, in the end, provided so many of the conditions for its own demolition. She thought about the night at the gala, standing at the east window with the weight of what she already knew pressing against the back of her sternum, watching Lucia Ferry's hand withdraw after the single light touch on her wrist. She thought about the bathroom, the scissors, the specific feeling of the first cut. Not liberating, not dramatic, not the thing it would become in the telling. Just precise. Just the feeling of a decision being executed. She thought about the inn in Connecticut, the small room, the ceiling, her breathing, even and slow. She thought about Thursday, the filing that had gone through at 9:47 in the morning while she was drinking coffee and watching a woman navigate a stroller over cracked sidewalk outside a window in Wilmington. She thought about the 7 months since then, the work, the building, the specific daily experience of being a person whose name was on the door. Not behind the door, not beneath the door, not in the architecture of a door that belonged to someone else. On it. Elaine knocked on the open door. "You have a call." "I know." She straightened up. She pulled the document back up on her screen and checked it once more. Old habit, the habit of a woman who had reviewed every document she'd ever produced at least twice, because the cost of a mistake was real and she took that seriously. The document was correct. She picked up the phone. The call was with a logistics firm in Atlanta, whose CEO was a woman named Diane Achebe, who had been running a company that was operationally sound and strategically overexposed, which was a specific kind of problem that Claire had spent 9 years learning to solve from the inside of someone else's organization, and had spent the last 7 months learning to solve in a context where the work was acknowledged and compensated and carried her name. She talked with Diane Achebe for 45 minutes. At the end of the call, Diane said, "I want to say something that might sound strange." "Say it," Claire said. "I've worked with a lot of consultants, strategy people, finance people, operations people, and they all come in with their frameworks and their slide decks, and they present a version of your own company back to you that's supposed to feel like insight." A pause. "You don't do that. You see it. You see what's actually there. I don't know how to describe it, except to say that it feels like talking to someone who's been inside a building like ours for a very long time and came out knowing exactly which walls were load-bearing." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what happened," she said. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting with the May light on the window glass and the sound of Elaine's voice in the next office and the distant sound of the city through the building's walls. The continuous ambient fact of a world that was indifferent to what any particular person had survived and went on regardless. She set the phone on the desk. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. Not a clutch. Not the small formal things she'd carried to other people's events. A leather work bag that was large enough to hold the things she actually needed and that she had bought herself, for herself, in a shop in Georgetown in December, paying with a card that had her own name on it. She turned off the desk lamp. She said goodnight to Elaine, who waved from behind her desk without interrupting her call. She took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby and through the glass doors and out into the May evening, and the air was warm enough that she stopped for a moment on the sidewalk and let it land on her face. The warmth of it, the real warmth of a season that had actually arrived, unremarkable and sufficient and entirely, simply, hers. She had not cut her hair since the night of the gala. It was growing back. Not to what it had been. She didn't want it to be what it had been, which had been beautiful in the way that things maintained for other people's pleasure are beautiful, carefully, at cost. It was growing into something that had no reference point except what it was now, which was enough. She walked to her car. She drove home. She made dinner in an apartment that smelled like coffee, and the specific neutral cleanness of a space that was becoming, incrementally and without ceremony, her own. She ate at the kitchen table with a book open beside her plate, a habit she'd had before she'd married and abandoned during and returned to now without making a production of it. She did not think about the empire. She did not think about the federal-style house with the 14-foot ceilings, or the hand-blown glass dessert plates, or the anniversary party, or the east window, or the cedar sachets that she still, sometimes, caught the memory of the smell of, and then let pass. She thought about the call with Diane Achebe, about which walls were load-bearing. She thought about the 12 people in the office upstairs, and the 3 of them who had come from the organization she'd left, and the 9 who had come from somewhere else entirely, from references and introductions, and the slow accumulation of professional reputation that happens when the work is visible and the name on it is your own. She thought about tomorrow, about the documents that needed review and the client call at 9, and the conversation with Elaine about the prospective engagement in Chicago that they'd been evaluating for 2 weeks. She thought about the work. It was not uncomplicated. It was not without cost. She was not a woman who had emerged from 11 years of a particular life without marks, without the specific weight that accumulates when a person has made a sustained practice of pouring themselves into something that wasn't theirs, without the particular quality of wariness that came from having trusted incorrectly and having understood that trust, while still necessary, was now something she extended slowly and with clear eyes. But she was working, she was building, she was making decisions that mattered, at a table that bore her name, for people who understood what they were hiring and compensated it accordingly. The woman who had walked out of a Connecticut estate at 2 a.m. with a single suitcase and a pair of dressmaking shears somewhere in her recent past was sitting at a kitchen table in Virginia eating dinner with a book, and the empire that had not included her name was gone, and she was not. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that was true. She turned the page. Outside, the Virginia night settled in, warm and ordinary and full of the specific, unspectacular continuity of a world that keeps going, that doesn't mark the moments when someone decides to begin again, that offers no ceremony and no applause, only the next morning and the work it contains, which was, she had decided, more than enough. She turned another page. The lamp on the kitchen table held its small circle of light. She read,